You're driving alone, just you and the road. It's dark. The forest around you feels alive, silent but somehow watching. Every turn seems familiar, yet every shadow feels like it's closing in. But then you see it, a figure on the side of the road. At first, you think it's just a trick of the light. But when you pass them, you swear you hear a whisper from the trees calling your name. You try to drive faster, but the road never seems to end. What would you do if the forest never let you leave? Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white under the pressure. It had been a long, exhausting shift at the diner, and he just wanted to get home. The radio in his car crackled with static, the sound of nothingness filling the otherwise silent vehicle. He glanced at the clock, 2:15 a.m. The moon hung high, casting an eerie light through the trees surrounding the winding road. He had taken this route many times before, a shortcut through the forest that always seemed to shave some time off his long journey. But tonight was different. The road felt alive. His headlights cut through the thick fog, illuminating the twisted branches of trees that seemed to stretch toward him like skeletal arms. The mist swirled around his car, clinging to the windows, and for a moment he couldn't tell if it was the fog that was clouding his mind or something more sinister. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the road ahead. The tires hummed against the asphalt, but the sound felt distorted, as though the road itself was somehow off. He tried to shake the feeling, but the more he drove, the more the forest seemed to press in on him. The trees, dark and looming, stood like silent sentinels on either side of the road. They watched him, or at least it felt like they did. The only thing keeping him grounded was the dim glow of the headlights, but it was as if they barely made a dent in the endless night. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, just as it should be, but for some reason his stomach twisted. The feeling of being followed lingered in the air, a creeping sensation that made his skin crawl. There was nothing, he told himself, just a trick of the mind. He'd driven this road dozens of times before and nothing ever happened. But tonight something was different. His breath quickened as he pushed the accelerator, hoping to get through the forest as quickly as possible. The fog thickened. The headlights flickered. And then there it was, a figure. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. At first he thought it was just another trick of the mist, something his tired eyes had conjured, but no. The figure was standing at the edge of the road, just outside the reach of the headlights. It was a woman. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly to the side, long hair tangled and wild, her body draped in tattered clothes that seemed out of place for this time of year. Daniel's first instinct was to stop, to ask if she needed help, but something deep inside, held him back. His foot hovered over the brake, but he didn't slow down. His breath caught in his throat. What the hell was she doing out here? He glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind him was empty. There was no sign of any cars. Just the woman standing there, staring into the headlights. Maybe she's lost, Daniel muttered to himself, though the words sounded hollow in his ears. He forced his foot off the accelerator, slowing down as he approached. He couldn't just leave her out here, could he? The closer he got, the more unsettling it became. There was something about her, something not quite right. Her gaze seemed fixed on him, her eyes empty, hollow, like they were seeing straight through him. The world outside the car seemed to fade away, the engine's hum growing distant as his heart thudded in his chest. The mist rolled thicker, and Daniel felt his throat tighten. At the last second, just as he was about to pass her, he swore he saw her smile. It was a faint, unsettling smile, stretched too wide. The expression didn't belong to a person. Felt wrong. Daniel's foot slammed back down on the accelerator, pushing the car forward with a jolt. He didn't dare look back. The car sped down the road, the tires screeching slightly against the wet asphalt. His breath was shallow, quick, his hands slick against the wheel. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to look at the road ahead, to focus on the path, to reassure himself that everything was fine. The forest stretched on, too long, too quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had noticed him. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing. The road behind him was as empty as it had been before. But just then there it was again, the faintest whisper. The kind of whisper you couldn't be sure was real, but that gnawed at the edges of your mind. It came from outside the car. No, not outside. From inside his own head. His eyes widened. He could hear it now, clear as day. His name. Daniel? His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel harder, his knuckles a sickly shade of white. The whisper came again, closer this time. He could almost feel it, like it was brushing against the back of his neck, as if something, was just inches away watching him. Stop it, stop it, stop it, he whispered to himself. The words spilled out like a desperate prayer. But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder. Daniel? The voice didn't sound like anyone he knew. It wasn't his mother or anyone from his past. It was cold, detached, almost mechanical. The air around him grew heavier, pressing in on him as though the very atmosphere of the forest was turning against him. He blinked rapidly, trying to push the panic away. But the voice didn't stop. He sped up, the car's engine roaring louder, the tires skidding slightly as he navigated the curves in the road. But no matter how fast he went, no matter how far he drove, the voice stayed with him. It followed him like an unshakable shadow, always just a breath behind. With every passing second, Daniel's nerves tightened. His hands were slick with sweat. His heart beat in his ears. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The voice was all he could hear now, echoing in his mind. Daniel? And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that rang in his ears. His eyes darted to the road ahead, his gaze wild, but there was nothing. The road was still empty, the mist still swirling. But the chill in the air wasn't just from the cold. Felt wrong. In the distance, he thought he saw something moving. A figure just at the edge of the headlights, flickering in and out like a mirage. Daniel slammed his foot on the brake, but the car didn't respond. The brakes squealed in protest, but the figure didn't vanish. It only grew closer, faster. Not again, Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. His hands shook violently as he tried to steer the wheel, but the road seemed to stretch on forever, pulling him deeper into the unknown. The forest was no longer a backdrop, it was a living, breathing thing closing in, suffocating him. And then, just as the figure reached the edge of the headlights, the car's engine stalled. Everything stopped. Daniel sat there, frozen in place, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the only sound was the distant hum of the trees. And the whisper. Daniel? Daniel's breath hitched in his chest as the engine sputtered to a complete stop. He gripped the steering wheel, his fingers stiff and unyielding, his heart pounding against his ribs. The car sat still, motionless, as if caught in a web of unseen forces. The silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like the world had disappeared, like the forest had swallowed everything around him, leaving only the echo of his own heartbeat in the air. He glanced nervously around. The mist, thick and relentless, had swallowed up everything but the outline of the road ahead. The headlights, which had once been his only guide through the darkness, now flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally on the road. Come on, Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice strained. His hand trembled as he turned the key again, but the engine remained silent. He tried again. Nothing. The whispers from earlier seemed to hang in the air, a ghostly presence just beyond the veil of his thoughts. He could still hear it, faint but persistent. His name. Daniel? It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a force, something that seemed to crawl into his mind and settle there, twisting his thoughts, tightening the knot of dread in his stomach. His pulse quickened. He couldn't be sure if it was the fear or the exhaustion from his long shift, but something about this didn't feel like an ordinary breakdown. He could sense the weight of the forest around him, pressing in on him from all sides. Suddenly, a sharp noise pierced the air, a crack, followed by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. His head snapped to the left. There was something out there. He wasn't imagining it. The forest, once silent, now seemed to stir. He could hear it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer, not from the road but from the trees, moving with an eerie rhythm that felt too purposeful. Daniel's throat constricted. He didn't want to look, but he had no choice. His eyes darted to the side, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows. But the footsteps, they were getting closer. He turned his attention back to the dashboard, his hands clammy against the wheel. He had to get out of here. He had to move. Panic surged through him as he pressed his foot against the accelerator again. The car's engine groaned in protest, but it refused to start. The footsteps were closer now. He could hear them, heavy like something large was moving through the underbrush. His heart thudded in his chest. He locked the doors even though he knew it wouldn't make a difference. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. And then the whispers came again. Daniel? He jerked his head back toward the rearview mirror. There was nothing. But for a split second he thought he saw something. Just a flash, a glimpse of movement behind him in the reflection of the mirror. He froze, staring at the glass, his heart racing. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly it hurt, but he couldn't move. The whisper came again, this time clearer, almost mocking in its tone. Why are you running? Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. as if the thing, whatever it was, knew what he was thinking. His skin crawled. He turned his head slowly, scanning the empty road behind him. Nothing. Just the dark expanse of the forest, the twisted trees standing like silent sentinels. The mist had thickened again, rolling in like a living thing, pressing against the windows, blocking out the light. He turned back to the front, eyes wide with terror. The engine was still dead. He was stuck in the middle of nowhere, in a forest that seemed to stretch on forever, with something, or someone, watching him from the shadows. A loud crack of a twig snapped in the woods to his left, sending a jolt of panic through him. His head whipped around to the side. The footsteps were right outside the car now, just a few feet away, as though the thing was standing in the trees just beyond his line of sight. Then, something scraped against the car. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like claws dragging along metal. He pressed his back into the seat, every muscle in his body tensed. His eyes darted between the mirrors, but the figure, or whatever it was, remained hidden in the shadows. Another scrape, this time louder. A heavy breath left his lips as he twisted the key one more time. The engine coughed. It sputtered. For a moment, Daniel thought it was finally going to start. But then the car died again. "Please, please, please," Daniel whispered to himself, almost pleading. "Just start." But then, there it was again. The voice. "Daniel?" This time it wasn't just a whisper. It was closer. It felt like it was coming from inside the car, like it was breathing down his neck. His eyes shot to the rearview mirror once again, and this time he saw it. A pale face, just inches away from the glass, staring back at him with wide, hollow eyes. A woman's face, twisted, grotesque, her skin stretched tight over her skull, her mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers started to ache. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure outside the window grinned wider, its lips stretching impossibly thin, like the smile was made of razor-sharp bone. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body was frozen. The only thing he could hear was his own rapid breathing, his heart hammering in his chest, louder than the voice that had now become a distorted hiss. "Let me in, Daniel." The words sliced through the air like a blade. The voice, was it her? Or something else? The figure's face pressed harder against the window, its breath fogging up the glass as it leaned closer, its eyes wide with an unsettling hunger. Daniel jerked his head back toward the front of the car, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He couldn't escape. No matter how much he wanted to drive away, there was nowhere to go. The car was dead. The road was endless. And the thing outside, it was still there, waiting. And then the woman's voice came again, this time a soft laugh that sent chills down his spine. "You can't run from what's already inside, Daniel." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as the woman's laughter echoed in his ears, leaving a sickly taste on his tongue. He didn't dare look at the rearview mirror again. He knew she was there, he could feel it. Her eyes were still on him, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He could almost hear the air around him thickening, as if the forest itself had come alive with a malevolent presence. The car was still dead. The silence that followed her chilling laugh was worse than the sound of the footsteps earlier. The whispering stopped. The rustling of the leaves seemed to have ceased altogether. And in the distance, the moon was now hidden behind thick clouds, plunging the world into an unnatural darkness. The mist had thickened again, so dense that it seemed to have a form of its own, crawling along the ground and swirling around the tires of the car. The trees were just shadows, silent sentinels that stretched high into the sky, like dark fingers reaching toward the heavens. Daniel's hands were clammy. His palms slick with sweat, his fingers aching from their death grip on the steering wheel. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest tight with fear. He needed to get out of here. He needed to move. But his mind was clouded with doubt. Could he really just drive off? What if it wasn't just a breakdown? What if something was stopping him, something more than just mechanical failure? The thought gnawed at him, a slow drip of terror that he couldn't shake. And then the silence shattered. A loud crash erupted from the right, coming from deep in the woods. A branch snapped, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Daniel flinched. His head snapped to the side, eyes scanning the blackness beyond the mist. His mouth went dry. The rustling was getting louder, moving closer like something, or someone, was drawing near. He could hear the brush crackling, the branches shifting under the weight of whatever was out there. A soft grunt pierced the air. It was the sound of something breathing. But it wasn't human. No, it was deep, guttural, like the exhale of a beast, the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand straight up. It came from behind the car. Daniel turned sharply. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all he saw was a reflection of the fog, thick and suffocating. His fingers were shaking so badly that he couldn't make sense of the image in the glass. The mist moved, but there was something else. Something that didn't belong. Something behind him. He slammed his foot on the brake, the car lurching forward as the weight of his panic took control. He tried the engine again. Nothing. Not even a sputter. The rustling was louder now. Closer. He heard heavy footsteps, like boots dragging through the brush, but far too heavy for any human to make. His blood ran cold. His hands clenched the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't. And then, out of nowhere, the headlights flickered back on. The sudden brightness was jarring, cutting through the fog like a blade. For a brief moment, Daniel saw it. A figure. Not a man. Not a woman. It was too tall, too thin, its body almost skeletal, shrouded in shadow and standing just at the edge of the trees. Its arms stretched unnaturally long, reaching out like tendrils from a nightmare. Its head, devoid of features except for hollow, empty eyes, stared directly at him. The world stopped. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching him as if waiting for Daniel to make the next move. But something inside Daniel snapped. He couldn't sit there any longer, not knowing if that thing was going to come any closer. Without thinking, he yanked the door handle, throwing it open with such force that it slammed against the side of the car. The cold air hit him like a slap, the gust of wind almost knocking him off his feet. His shoes scraped against the gravel as he stumbled out of the car, hands shaking, his mind in a frenzy. But the moment he stepped into the road, he froze. The footsteps were gone. The breathing too. Everything was silent again. The forest seemed to have swallowed the sound of his frantic movements, the mist wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. Daniel didn't know whether to run or stay. His mind screamed for him to run, to get away from whatever was out there, but his body felt like it had turned to stone. He took a step forward. Nothing. He took another. And then something snapped behind him. A sharp crack. The sound of a twig breaking. Daniel whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the mist, the silence. His chest tightened, and his breath came in short, shallow bursts. The air around him felt thick with something sinister, something that seemed to press in on him from all sides. His heart raced, each beat thumping loudly in his ears. He needed to get back to the car. He needed to. Suddenly the voice came again. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the thing he had seen standing in the shadows. This voice was different, deeper, older, more threatening. "Don't run, Daniel." His body froze. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding him, echoing in his ears, vibrating through his bones. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, something massive and all-encompassing, something that had been waiting for him to step into its grasp. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. Daniel took another step back, his breath shallow, panic rising like a tidal wave in his chest. But it was too late. The sound of heavy footsteps, the ones he had heard earlier, came from behind him once more. But this time they were closer. Closer than they had ever been. His head whipped around, but nothing was there. Not in front of him. Not in the trees. The mist thickened again, swirling in patterns, almost as though it were alive, and with it came the unmistakable sensation of something else. Something that had been watching him from the shadows. Something that was just waiting for the right moment to strike. Daniel could feel it, and it was getting closer. Daniel's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he turned around again, his heart racing. The forest was eerily silent now, the footsteps gone, leaving only the oppressive weight of the fog and the flickering light from his car's headlights to guide him. But the feeling lingered, the feeling that something was close, watching him from within the mist. It was as if the trees themselves were leaning in, their twisted branches reaching out toward him, hungry for his fear. His hands trembled as he wiped his forehead, sweat mixing with the cold air. The voice, the one that had spoken to him earlier, echoed in his mind. "Don't run, Daniel." It was like an invisible hand had pressed down on his chest, squeezing the air out of his lungs. The weight of it crushed him, almost as if the forest itself were alive, aware of him, feeding off his anxiety. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, but his feet refused to move. He couldn't leave. He didn't know why, but he felt rooted to this place, like the ground had turned to quicksand. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the trees. A low growl. It wasn't the kind of growl he expected. Not an animal. This was different. It was deep, reverberating like something ancient and predatory. Daniel stiffened, his eyes wide, scanning the shadows between the trunks. He couldn't see it, whatever it was. The fog was too thick, too heavy, as if it were purposefully blocking his view, keeping him from seeing the thing that stalked him. He turned quickly, his eyes darting back toward the car, his mind screaming at him to get back inside. The door was open. The keys were still in the ignition. But something was wrong. As he looked back at the car, a wave of dread crashed over him. It wasn't the same anymore. The headlights, once bright and steady, flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows across the empty road. The car didn't look like his anymore. It had changed. Its body seemed to have grown darker, almost as though it was absorbing the surrounding darkness itself. He hesitated. Hadn't the headlights been steady before? Was the car always like this? The question lingered in his mind, gnawing at him, but he couldn't think clearly. His hands were shaking too badly, his heart too loud. His body screamed to move, to run, but something held him in place. The fog, the trees, the silence, the whispering voices that had followed him. And then the growl returned, closer this time, louder. His eyes snapped back to the forest. His pulse quickened and panic surged through his veins like ice. He wasn't alone. The shadows in the trees began to shift. It was subtle at first, just a movement in the corner of his eye, a ripple through the mist. But then a shape emerged, too dark to be just a trick of the light. It was a figure, tall and twisted like a man, but its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its head was angled too far back, its neck grotesquely elongated, and as it stepped into the faint glow of the headlights, Daniel saw its face, or what was left of it, was hollow, empty. Its eyes were just dark sockets, deep and cold, staring right at him. Daniel froze, his body rooted to the spot. His heart hammered in his chest, pounding against his ribcage as the creature took another step forward, its feet making no sound on the ground, as if it were floating toward him. The air grew colder with each step it took, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Daniel's breath turned to mist in the air, swirling around him like smoke. He didn't know what it was, but it was wrong. So wrong. The way it moved, the way it looked. It wasn't human. Not anymore. And it was getting closer. A low, distorted voice slipped from its hollow mouth, like a rasping whisper. "I told you not to run, Daniel." The name sent a shiver down his spine, the words wrapping around him like a vice. How did it know his name? Who, or what, was this thing? Daniel's legs finally obeyed him, his survival instincts kicking in. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the gravel road. His body was on autopilot now, moving purely on fear. He didn't dare look back. But as he ran, the mist seemed to close in on him, suffocating him, wrapping itself tighter around his legs, making each step harder to take. The shadows from the trees reached out, brushing against his skin like cold fingers. And then, just as he thought he was escaping, a sharp pain shot through his ankle. He stumbled, falling forward into the gravel. His hands scraped against the road as he tried to push himself up. His ankle was twisted, the pain blinding, but he forced himself to stand. Not now. Not here. Not like this. But as he pushed off the ground, his gaze was drawn to something he hadn't noticed before, something strange in the distance. A light. A dim, flickering light just past the bend in the road. It was small, too far to make out clearly, but it was there. It looked like the faint glow of a lantern, like something, was waiting for him. His heart skipped a beat. Was it a person? Someone else trapped in this nightmare? With his body screaming in pain and fear, Daniel limped forward, his gaze locked on the flickering light. His thoughts were jumbled, spinning out of control. The creature was still behind him. He could feel it in his bones, its presence like a shadow looming over his every step. As he limped closer, the light seemed to grow brighter, but the closer he got, the more disorienting it became. The road stretched on, longer than he remembered, the light still too far ahead, no matter how much he pushed himself forward. And then the voice came again, softer this time, but just as chilling. "You won't make it, Daniel." He froze. The voice, it wasn't coming from behind him anymore. It was coming from the light. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His body locked in place. He couldn't move. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run, but the light was too close, too real, and something was waiting for him there. Something far worse than whatever had been stalking him in the woods. Daniel's breath hitched in his chest, the air colder than it had ever been before. His body shook, not from the chill, but from a bone-deep terror that gripped him harder than the mist surrounding him. The light in front of him flickered again, its faint glow pulling him forward, like an invisible force tugging on his very soul. "You won't make it, Daniel." The voice repeated, this time more insistent, the words seeping into his mind like a poison. But it wasn't just the voice that sent a wave of panic crashing over him, it was the feeling that something was waiting for him in the light. Something he wasn't prepared to face. His twisted ankle burned with pain, but he limped forward, each step slow, each movement heavier than the last. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the light growing brighter, yet never closer. It was as if he were caught in some kind of sick game, a cruel trick designed to drag him deeper into the forest's grip. The growl from behind him was faint, but unmistakable. A low rumble, like thunder reverberating from the depths of the earth. The creature wasn't far. He could feel it. Its presence had grown stronger, closer, like it was breathing down his neck. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. But what if the light was worse? What if the creature was not the only thing that could kill him here? What if the light was its trap? His heart pounded harder. He could almost hear the snap of branches underfoot, the creature's footsteps drawing nearer. The air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second, as if the forest itself were pushing him toward the light, trapping him in its twisted grip. Then as he moved closer, something happened. The fog parted slightly, just enough for him to see the light clearly, and the shadows, shifting, warping, began to take shape. Figures. Multiple figures, hunched and misshapen, standing just outside the reach of the light. He stopped dead in his tracks, his chest tightening. The figures were still, frozen, but there was no mistaking their eyes. Hollow, empty sockets just like the creature from earlier. They weren't human. Their forms were contorted, unnatural, their arms too long, too thin. They were watching him. Every single one of them, their empty gazes locked onto him, unblinking. The voice in his mind grew louder, more menacing. "You're too late, Daniel." He turned, adrenaline surging through his veins. The path behind him, the way he had come, was no longer clear. The trees had closed in. The fog had thickened. The road he had traveled was swallowed whole by the darkness. No escape. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his breath, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. And then came the whisper, low and cold, just behind him. "You can't outrun the past." Daniel whipped around, his eyes scanning the twisted trees. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the flickering light and the hunched figures in the distance. But it wasn't them. It wasn't their voice. It was his own. He didn't understand. He didn't know what was happening, but something in his gut told him that the past, his past, was tied to this place, this nightmare. He stumbled back, his eyes wild with panic. The light seemed so close now, but still unreachable. Still a lie. The more he fought to move toward it, the more the figures in the shadows seemed to draw closer. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like they were waiting for something. Waiting for him to make the wrong move. Suddenly, the forest shifted again. The ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple, as if it were alive, reacting to his every step. The trees groaned, their branches creaking like old bones. A harsh, guttural laugh echoed in the distance, a sound so distorted, so unnatural that it made his skin crawl. Daniel's chest tightened. There was no escape. Not from the creatures. Not from the light. Not from whatever was waiting for him at the end of the road. But something in him snapped. The fear that had been choking him, squeezing the life out of him, shattered. He could feel it in his gut, his survival instincts kicking in. This wasn't just about running anymore. This wasn't just about escape. This was about facing what was coming for him. He took a deep breath, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. His mind raced, trying to think, to figure out what the light was, what these figures were, what he needed to do to survive. But every time he tried to focus, the whispers came again. "You can't run. You never could." Daniel's thoughts snapped to the memories of his childhood. His parents, his house, his town. The feeling of being watched. The feeling of something following him. Even then, he thought it was just his imagination. But now, in the midst of this nightmare, he realized the truth. It wasn't his imagination. It was real. His eyes widened in horror as the realization hit him. This wasn't just happening to him. This had been happening all his life. The town, the forest, the creatures. It had all led to this moment. His past, his history, had been a trail of breadcrumbs leading him into the heart of this twisted nightmare. The ground trembled beneath him as if the very earth was awakening. The growl behind him grew louder, closer. He turned and the figure was there. The one from before. The creature with the hollow eyes, its face twisted in agony, reaching out for him. He was trapped. But then, through the fog, something else caught his eye. A shadow. A movement. A figure. A person. Emerging from the darkness. Was it a person? Or was it just another trick? Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't trust anything anymore. As the figure drew closer, the air grew colder, the shadows growing longer. And that voice, that horrifying voice, echoed once more. "You should have listened, Daniel. It's too late." Everything stopped. The forest, the growl, the whispers, all of it. And then, from the shadows, the figure stepped forward, the last thing Daniel ever expected to see. It was him. But it wasn't. A twisted version of himself, grinning, eyes hollow. And it was coming for him. The air seemed to freeze the moment Daniel locked eyes with the figure before him. His breath caught in his throat, and his heart thundered in his chest. The figure stood only a few feet away, its movements slow and deliberate, his eyes, empty, hollow, and cold. It was him. But it wasn't. His doppelganger's face was twisted into a grotesque smile, a smile that shouldn't have belonged to him. The dark, wild eyes that stared back at him were the same, yet so wrong. It was like looking into a mirror, but everything was off. The figure's skin was pale, deathly so, and its mouth stretched too wide, showing teeth far too sharp for comfort. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine, a feeling more bone-chilling than the cold air surrounding him. This wasn't just a look-alike, it was a reflection of everything he feared, everything he had tried to run from. It stepped forward, the air around it rippling, like it was bending the world itself. Daniel took a shaky step back, his legs shaking beneath him, but his feet refused to move any further. He couldn't run. Not now. The creature was close enough to touch him, and the way it stared, the way it moved, there was no escaping. It was him, and yet it wasn't. It knew everything about him. The fear in his heart, the mistakes he had made, the secrets he'd buried. The creature smiled again, the smile stretching even further, and for a moment, Daniel thought it was going to speak. But it didn't. It only tilted its head as if studying him, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to react. Daniel's pulse raced as he struggled to find words. He opened his mouth, but his voice seemed lost, swallowed by the forest, by the fog, by the sheer terror that gripped him. His throat tightened. It was as if the air had turned to stone, and every breath he tried to take came out in ragged gasps. Who are you?" Daniel stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure's grin widened, impossibly wide, and for a second, Daniel thought he saw something flicker, something dark and sinister, behind its empty gaze. The smile wasn't comforting. It wasn't human. It was mocking. "I am you," the figure spoke, but the voice that came from its mouth wasn't his own. It was darker, colder, and echoed with a twisted distortion. "And you are me. Always have been." Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs, the words sinking into him like a poison. "What does that mean? What are you?" The doppelganger chuckled, low and menacing, the sound rattling Daniel's bones. "You don't remember, do you? You've forgotten everything. But I haven't. I've always been here, hiding, waiting for you to remember." The fog around them seemed to close in tighter, thicker now, like it was suffocating him, pushing him toward the twisted version of himself. His breath hitched as he tried to understand what was happening. His mind was racing, but the more he thought, the more it all became a blur. A nightmare. A twisted cycle. It was like his past was coming back to haunt him. The doppelganger took another step closer, and Daniel's pulse quickened. "No, this can't be happening." "Oh, but it is," the figure whispered, stepping even closer, its voice now almost a hiss. "You ran from me. You tried to forget. But here I am. You can't escape me. Not anymore." Daniel's knees weakened, and he stumbled backward, his head spinning. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting and shifting as if the land itself was alive, eager to swallow him whole. The path he'd come from, the path that had once seemed clear, was now gone, swallowed up by the darkness. There was no escape. The figure reached out, its fingers cold and skeletal. "Do you remember now, Daniel?" it asked, its voice soft, taunting. "Do you remember what you did?" Daniel's stomach twisted, a deep, gnawing feeling in his gut. The figure's words cut through him like a blade. He didn't want to remember. He couldn't. The doppelganger's cold hand hovered just inches from his face. "You can't run. You can't hide. You never could. The past is always here, waiting for you to face it." Daniel closed his eyes tightly, his hands trembling at his sides. He didn't want to hear it. Didn't want to listen. He had tried so hard to forget, to outrun the nightmares that had haunted him for so long. But the memories were coming back, flooding his mind like an uncontrollable tide. He saw flashes, familiar faces, voices he couldn't place. Images of his childhood, his family, his town. And then the darkness, the same darkness he had felt as a child. The fear, the shadows, the feeling that something was always watching him, always following him. The figure laughed, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. You thought you could escape it, but the truth is you never left. It's always been here, with you, waiting. Daniel's heart pounded harder, the pressure in his chest almost suffocating. No, please, he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't remember. You will, the figure promised, its voice dripping with malice. You will remember. And when you do, you'll understand. You'll understand everything. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, its skeletal hand grabbing Daniel by the wrist. The contact was ice cold, like the grip of death itself. Daniel tried to pull away, but it was no use. The figure's strength was overwhelming, inhuman. His vision blurred, the world spinning around him, and the whispers began to intensify, rising to a deafening crescendo. The voice of his doppelganger echoed in his mind, repeating the same words over and over. You can't outrun the truth. You can't escape your past. And then everything went dark. The fog swallowed him whole, and for a moment, Daniel was left in the suffocating blackness, unable to see or hear anything. He was alone. But was he really? Daniel awoke with a sharp gasp, his body jerking upright as if the weight of his nightmares had physically dragged him back into the waking world. His heart raced, his breath shallow and erratic as he looked around. The forest had vanished. The eerie fog, the shadowy figures, the doppelganger, it was all gone. He was alone in his car again, the engine still running, the headlights cutting through the dark road. For a moment he thought it had been a dream, a terrible, twisted nightmare. But deep down he knew better. The car's interior was cold, too cold, and the air around him seemed charged with a strange, unsettling energy. He looked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing behind him. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and as he dared to glance over his shoulder, the unsettling silence of the forest outside seemed to press in on him. Was it really gone? Was he free? Just as he began to convince himself that he had escaped whatever nightmare had haunted him, the radio crackled to life. The sudden noise made him jump, his body tensing. His heart thudded in his chest, and his fingers froze on the wheel. Daniel? The voice wasn't the familiar hum of a broadcast. It was soft, sinister, and unmistakably human. His name echoed through the car's speakers, as if it were being whispered directly into his ear. No? Daniel whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. The radio flickered, and the voice came again, this time louder, clearer, more deliberate. Daniel, it's time. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His pulse raced, his breath quickening. That voice, it sounded like his own, yet not his own. It was twisted, wrong, distorted. He slammed his hand on the radio, desperately trying to turn it off, but the static only grew louder, distorting the words further. But you can't escape. You are the monster. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, freezing him in place. His eyes darted around the car, but there was nothing visible. The road stretched endlessly in front of him, dark and empty. But the voice continued. You've always been running from yourself, haven't you, Daniel? He didn't want to hear it. He couldn't listen any longer. His hands were shaking, his whole body trembling as panic set in. The forest was behind him, he could feel it even though he couldn't see it. The trees, the shadows, they were still there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in the pocket of his jacket. His hand shot to it instinctively, his heart already racing faster. As he pulled it out and unlocked the screen, the familiar name on the display sent a shock of icy fear through his veins. It was a message from himself. The text read, "I'm still with you." A cold sweat broke out over his skin. His mouth went dry as the phone began to ring. The number? Unknown. But the sound of it, the ring itself, was enough to send his mind spiraling. He hesitated, staring at the screen for what felt like an eternity. What if it was him? "Pick it up," the voice from the radio whispered again, much softer this time, almost tender, as if coaxing him. "It's only the beginning." With a trembling hand, Daniel answered the phone. Silence. Then a breath. A deep, ragged breath, followed by the same voice. His voice. "Are you ready to face it all, Daniel?" Before he could respond, the image on his phone screen flickered. His heart nearly stopped when he saw it, the same twisted version of himself staring back from the other end of the call. It was smiling, that grotesque, sinister smile, the same twisted grin from the forest. The eyes were hollow, empty. "Come back," the voice on the other end said softly. "It's waiting for you." The phone call ended and the screen went black. Daniel's chest tightened, the walls of the car closing in on him. The fog had returned, and with it the oppressive weight of the forest. The same forest, the same road. No, this wasn't possible. He had left that place. He had escaped. But now the car didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like a cage. The engine sputtered. The headlights flickered. And before he could react, the radio crackled again, louder this time. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the shrill static, and his heart felt as if it would burst from his chest. The voice returned, more insistent this time, more urgent. "You're not going anywhere, Daniel. We're waiting for you." The car came to a sudden stop. He slammed his foot on the brake, but the car refused to move. It was stuck. Trapped. Daniel's mind raced, panic surging through his veins. He looked out the windows, but all he could see was fog, dense, suffocating fog that seemed to wrap around him, closing in from every side. The trees were gone, replaced by an endless void. His headlights struggled to pierce the darkness. And then the forest appeared again, shadows flickering between the trees, familiar figures shifting just beyond the edge of the light. He could hear them. They were out there, watching him. The engine stalled again and the lights blinked off. Everything was quiet for a moment, but the silence felt wrong. It was too still, too suffocating. He heard a whisper, so faint at first that he thought it was just his imagination. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it was a chorus, voices, millions of voices, all speaking at once, all calling his name. Daniel. Daniel. The fog thickened. The shadows closed in. And that's when he saw it. A figure standing just outside his car window. A twisted version of himself, just like before, but this time, it wasn't smiling. It was crying. It was pleading with him. The figure pressed its face against the glass, its mouth moving silently as it whispered something Daniel couldn't hear. He could see its breath fogging up the window, its face distorted by the condensation. Then it spoke. "Come home." Before he could react, the glass shattered with a deafening crack, and Daniel was dragged out of the car, pulled into the cold darkness. Everything went black. The forest was waiting. And Daniel, he was never meant to leave. Amelia sat alone in the dim light of her living room, the sound of her own breath the only thing breaking the silence. The old house creaked and groaned as it always did, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with something she couldn't explain, something uneasy. The phone had rung once, but when she picked it up, there was only silence on the other end. Then the whisper came, "You're not alone, Amelia." She froze. Who was there? What did they want? And most importantly, how did they know her name? Amelia sat quietly in the living room, the clock ticking on the wall like a constant reminder of her solitude. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the wind rattling against the windows. She had been living alone in this house for a few months now. It was charming, with its vintage furnishings and large, sun-drenched windows that allowed the light to pour in during the day. But there was something about the nights that made her uneasy. Something just off. It was almost midnight when she first heard it. A faint scratching noise came from the hallway, soft but deliberate. It wasn't the usual sounds of the house settling. No, this was something different. Amelia froze in her seat, her fingers still gripping the remote control of the TV, her attention fully diverted to the noise. It was rhythmic, like fingernails dragging lightly across wood. She tried to dismiss it as nothing, a trick of her imagination, but then it happened again. A slow, deliberate scratch. Closer this time. Amelia's pulse quickened. She stood up, the floor creaking under her weight. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her first instinct was to check the windows to see if anyone was out there, but the house was surrounded by tall trees, too dark to see anything outside. Still, she walked cautiously toward the hallway. Every step felt too loud, too heavy in the stillness of the night. As she neared the source of the sound, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt colder now, as though something was lingering just beyond her reach. She reached the corner of the hallway and glanced around. The dim light from the living room barely illuminated the hallway, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The door at the end of the hall, leading to the basement, was slightly ajar. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She was sure she had closed that door earlier. She always did. The basement wasn't exactly a pleasant place to be, filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten items, and the lingering smell of mildew. She had never ventured down there, nor had she felt the need to. But tonight something felt different. "Stop being paranoid," she muttered to herself, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. But the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching her, didn't go away. Cautiously, she approached the basement door. The scratching noise had stopped, but the door creaked open on its own just a few inches. Amelia felt her breath catch in her throat. There was no wind, no reason for it to move. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice now trembling. The door didn't answer. The house remained eerily still. Her instinct screamed at her to leave, to turn around and never look back, but something kept her frozen in place. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but her curiosity had a vice-like grip on her. Slowly, she reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the door. Just as she was about to push it open further, the phone on the table in the living room rang. The sudden noise startled her, causing her to jump back. The phone continued to ring, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a blade. She turned away from the door, her heart racing as she hurried back to the living room. Her hand was still shaky as she grabbed the phone from its receiver. "Hello?" Amelia said, trying to steady her breath. She could hear the faint sound of breathing on the other end. A slow, shallow breath. Not a person's voice, just the sound of someone or something exhaling. Her stomach turned. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. Just more breathing, growing heavier now. She felt the air in the room become thick with tension, suffocating her. She could almost hear the beating of her own heart. Then, as quickly as the phone had rung, the line went dead. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. Amelia stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear. Her hands were shaking now, and she felt cold all over. She glanced at the clock. 12:17 a.m. The night felt endless. She wanted to brush it off. A prank call, maybe. She had heard strange things before. Mysterious noises in the house, the odd phone call here and there. Nothing out of the ordinary. But tonight it felt different. She turned toward the hallway once again, and that's when she saw it. The door to the basement was now wide open. No longer just ajar. It was open as though someone, or something, had been waiting for her to look. Amelia's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she considered running. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the doorway. There was something drawing her in. Something dark. Something that felt like it had been waiting for this moment, for her. She took a hesitant step toward the hallway, her legs feeling like lead. The shadows in the house seemed darker now, stretching unnaturally toward her. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that basement, whatever was behind that door, was closer than ever before. She reached the bottom of the stairs, peering into the darkness below. The smell of damp earth and stale air hit her, and she gagged. It was as though something had been rotting down there for years. The air was dense, oppressive. Just as she was about to turn back, she saw it. A shadow moving swiftly across the floor. It was too quick to be a trick of the light, and it didn't make any sound. Without thinking, Amelia stepped into the basement, the door creaking shut behind her with a force that sent a chill down her spine. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and she was trapped in it. The shadow moved again, but this time it was closer. It was right behind her. Amelia turned around, but there was nothing. Only darkness. Suddenly, the light bulb overhead flickered and died, plunging her into pitch black. She was not alone. Whatever had been in the basement with her was now in the shadows, watching, waiting. And then she heard it, a soft whisper in the dark. "Amelia, you should have never opened the door." Amelia's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen in the pitch-black basement, the oppressive silence pressing in on her from all sides. She felt as though the walls were closing in, as though the air itself was thickening with every passing second. The whisper, it came from somewhere behind her, just at the edge of her hearing, but when she turned around there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. Her breath was shallow now, the air in the basement damp and heavy, making every inhale feel like she was suffocating. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she strained her ears, waiting for something, anything. The whisper had been too real, too close, to be just her imagination. But why couldn't she see anything? It came again, this time louder, more distinct, sending a chill down her spine. "Amelia, you shouldn't have opened the door." She whipped around, her eyes wide and searching, but all she saw was darkness. The faint outline of boxes and old furniture blurred in the dimness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twitch and stretch at the edges of her vision. Panic crept up her throat. She stumbled backward, her legs shaking beneath her, knocking into something with a soft thud. Her hand shot out to steady herself, gripping an old wooden chair. Her fingers trembled violently as she held on, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She was alone. There was no one else here, no one could be here with her. She knew that. But the voice, it had been real. Taking a deep breath, Amelia forced herself to move. She couldn't stay here, not like this, lost in the darkness with a voice that seemed to come from nowhere. The basement felt wrong, like it was alive with something she couldn't see, something that was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. She stepped forward cautiously, her hands brushing against the cold walls as she moved deeper into the basement. The air was dense with dust, and every step she took seemed to echo through the space, amplifying the silence. Her footsteps grew louder in her own ears, and the darkness around her seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. Then, just as she thought she might finally make it back to the stairs, she felt it. The temperature in the room dropped, and with it, the weight of an unseen presence settled over her. The hairs on her arms prickled as if something cold was creeping up her skin. A soft draft of air touched her cheek, making her skin crawl. It was as though something or someone was standing just inches away from her. She turned abruptly, her eyes wide, but saw nothing but the creeping shadows. Another whisper broke through the silence. This time it came from directly behind her. "Why are you here, Amelia?" The voice was low, guttural, as though it had come from the depths of the earth itself. It was colder, sharper, and carried an edge of malice that sent a wave of terror crashing over her. Her body went rigid, and for a split second she thought she might collapse from sheer fear. But instead, her legs moved on their own, carrying her away from the darkness. She ran, her breath coming in shallow gasps as her feet hit the wooden floor, the sound of her panic-fueled footsteps reverberating through the space. She didn't stop to think, didn't even care about the noise anymore. She just needed to get out of here. But as she reached the stairs, something stopped her. A figure. A dark shape appeared at the top of the staircase, blocking her exit. Her blood turned to ice. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. A tall, thin figure, dressed in old, tattered clothes, standing motionless at the top of the stairs, his face obscured by a hood. Amelia's heart lurched in her chest. Who was this? What was this? Her pulse quickened, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She couldn't move. She couldn't even scream. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her with a sense of quiet, unyielding menace. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get away, but her feet refused to move. She was frozen in place, unable to tear her gaze away from the shadowy figure that seemed to consume the light around it. Then the figure stepped forward, slowly, inexorably. With every step it took, the air grew heavier, thicker, until it felt as though the very atmosphere in the room was suffocating her. The light flickered above, casting strange shadows that danced wildly across the walls, and the temperature dropped even further, making her breath visible in the air, a fog of panic escaping her lips. The figure's movements were deliberate, like the ticking of a clock, each step closer to her feeling like an eternity. Amelia's chest tightened, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that it was all she could hear. She didn't know what to do. She was trapped. "Amelia," the voice came again, soft and low, but this time it wasn't from the figure, it was from the darkness itself. The same whisper that had tormented her earlier. It was everywhere now, surrounding her. "Amelia," it repeated, and she felt the words crawl under her skin like 1,000 tiny insects. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The figure was right there, just a few feet away now. His eyes, though obscured by the hood, seemed to gleam in the dim light, and the closer he came, the stronger the presence of something unnatural seemed to grow. A cold, dry laugh echoed through the basement, the sound grating and disturbing as if it was mocking her. Amelia's knees finally gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor in a heap, gasping for air. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare she had found herself in. The figure was looming over her now, its presence so overwhelming that it felt like the very walls were closing in on her. She could barely make out the sound of the whisper now. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, all around her. She couldn't focus on them, couldn't understand the words, but she could feel them pressing into her mind like 1,000 knives. The figure's hand, cold and skeletal, reached toward her, and Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled backward, the cold floor scraping against her palms as she tried to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The shadows had surrounded her. And then, just as the hand was about to touch her, the basement light flickered once more, and the figure disappeared. Amelia was left in the crushing silence, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, but the fear that gripped her remained. The darkness had claimed her. The question now lingered, why had it come for her? And what was it waiting for? As the shadows closed in, Amelia knew one thing for sure. She had made a terrible mistake coming down here. And now there was no turning back. The silence in the house was deafening, like the world had stopped spinning, leaving Amelia alone in a suspended moment of fear. She sat there on the cold basement floor, shaking uncontrollably, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The figure, whatever it was, had vanished, but its presence lingered in every corner of the room, thick and suffocating. Her breathing was ragged, each inhale feeling more desperate than the last. Amelia wiped the sweat off her brow, trying to steady herself. Was she losing her mind? Could this all be some twisted hallucination? She had read about people seeing things under stress, but this was different. She wasn't just seeing things, she was feeling them. The air had changed. The house had changed. It was like she wasn't alone anymore. The basement door, the one that had been wide open when she had entered, was now shut tight, as if something had closed it while she wasn't looking. Her heart raced again, and she couldn't help but stare at it, watching the shadows play tricks with her mind. Amelia stood slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her, as if the fear had drained every ounce of strength from her body. She took a few shaky steps toward the stairs, but before she could make it, the basement light flickered again, an eerie hum echoing in the stillness, causing her to freeze in place. "Not again," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The light dimmed and then went out completely, plunging her into total darkness. Amelia froze, her eyes wide in terror, straining to see anything. The suffocating dark seemed to wrap around her like a heavy cloak. The only sound was the pounding of her own heartbeat. She reached out, feeling her way toward the stairs, but it was as though the basement had become a maze. The walls were no longer where they should be, and she felt as if the space itself was shifting, warping around her. She thought she heard something, a faint sound like a whisper just barely audible. Her breath caught in her throat. The air was thick with tension, and she couldn't tell if it was the house itself or her mind playing tricks on her. The walls were closing in, and the shadows were pressing against her. Suddenly, the whisper came again, but this time it was clearer, louder. "Amelia?" The voice was familiar now, too familiar. It was the same voice that had whispered earlier, but this time it was closer, much closer. Amelia spun around, her eyes wide in panic, searching desperately for the source of the voice. There was nothing. No movement. The basement was as still as a tomb. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely more than a breath. No answer. Her mind raced, and the weight of the silence in the room pressed down on her chest. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. She needed to get out. But as she turned to rush up the stairs, a cold breeze swept through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just the cold. It was an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She reached for the stairs, but as her hand touched the railing, she felt something that wasn't right. The metal of the railing felt wrong, too cold, too smooth. She jerked her hand back, but before she could react, the whispers started again, rising in volume, each one layering over the other until they became an unbearable cacophony. "Amelia, come back. Why did you leave? Stay with us." The voices filled her mind, drowning out all rational thought. She stumbled back from the stairs, her mind spinning. Her chest tightened with fear, her vision blurring. She couldn't breathe. The voices, there were so many of them, all speaking in unison, all demanding something from her. But what? What did they want? And then she heard it, a soft tapping sound. Almost imperceptible, but it was there. It came from the far corner of the basement, where the shadows were deepest. Amelia's gaze snapped to the corner, her blood running cold. The tapping was slow at first, rhythmic like a fingernail gently tapping against wood. It grew louder, more frantic, as if something, or someone, was trying to get her attention. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart racing, her breath shallow. What was that sound? It was so wrong, so out of place that she almost didn't want to investigate. But she couldn't help herself. She had to know. With trembling hands, Amelia reached out into the darkness, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp wall. The tapping continued, growing louder with each step she took toward the corner. She could feel the floor beneath her feet shift, as if the very foundation of the house was trembling with anticipation. And then she saw it. A shape in the corner, a faint outline barely visible in the darkness. It was moving, slowly but with deliberate intent. The tapping was coming from it. Amelia's pulse skyrocketed as she strained her eyes to make out the figure. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The shape, it was crawling. Slowly, impossibly, it was crawling toward her, dragging itself along the floor, its limbs moving in unnatural, jerky motions. The tapping sound grew louder as it came closer, and Amelia's stomach churned with horror. She wanted to scream, but the fear was choking her, silencing her. The figure's face, if it could even be called that, was hidden in shadow, but she could see its mouth. Its twisted, elongated mouth stretched wide, as though it had been contorted by something beyond human understanding. And there, just barely visible, were its eyes, dark, soulless pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the world stood still, suspended in terrifying silence. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like time itself had frozen, leaving her trapped in this nightmare. Then, with a sudden, unnatural movement, the creature lunged at her. Amelia screamed, finally, a scream that tore through her throat, raw and desperate. But it was too late. The creature's cold, clammy hand wrapped around her ankle, its fingers digging into her flesh like claws. In one swift motion, it yanked her down to the ground, dragging her back toward the darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the twisted smile of the thing that had been waiting for her. And then silence. The kind of silence that only comes when all hope is lost. Amelia was gone. And the house, it waited. The days that followed were a blur for Lucas. His mind was a tangled mess of worry and confusion, but beneath it all, a sickening feeling of dread had settled deep in his gut. Amelia had been missing for nearly 2 days now. No one knew where she had gone or what had happened to her. The police were doing their best, but Lucas could sense that they were grasping at straws, hoping to find a lead, any lead, that could explain the bizarre situation. He had gone to Amelia's house, of course. It was a place that still carried traces of her presence. The scent of lavender on the pillows, the soft hum of the coffee machine that never seemed to stop brewing. But walking through the house now was like walking through a mausoleum. It was eerily silent, a silence that carried the weight of something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. He'd been in her room, sifting through her things, trying to find something, anything, that could explain where she had gone. But nothing made sense. Her phone was still on the nightstand, the screen cracked, the battery dead. Her purse was still hanging on the back of the door, and her shoes were neatly placed in the corner, as though she had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any minute. But the longer Lucas stayed there, the more he felt that something was wrong. Very wrong. As he paced through the empty house, his eyes were drawn to the basement door. It was shut tightly, just as it had been when Amelia had gone missing. He had been avoiding it since the moment he'd arrived. The strange, unnerving energy that seemed to radiate from that basement was too much for him. He had heard rumors, whispers about the house, about things that had happened long before Amelia had moved in. Stories of people disappearing, of strange noises late at night, of shadowy figures in the corners of rooms. But Lucas hadn't believed any of it. Not at first. Now, with Amelia gone, with the terrifying events of the past few days weighing on him, those whispers were starting to sound less like rumors and more like truth. His hand hovered over the basement door handle for a long moment before he steeled himself. The air in the house felt thick, as though it was holding its breath. With a deep sigh, he turned the handle. The door creaked open, and Lucas stepped inside, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows across the cold concrete floor. The basement smelled musty, damp, like it hadn't been properly aired out in years. His breath fogged in the air as he made his way down the creaky stairs, each step echoing loudly in the oppressive quiet. At the bottom, he stopped, surveying the dark room. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. There was something wrong here, something that made his skin crawl. The room felt alive, as though it was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. His eyes moved across the space. The old furniture, covered in dust, stood in the corners like forgotten relics from another time. In the far corner there was a large, old wooden chest. He had never seen it before. Amelia hadn't mentioned it, and he was sure she had never spoken of it. His curiosity got the better of him, and he made his way toward it. He reached out and touched the chest, the wood cold and smooth beneath his fingertips. There was a small lock on the front, rusted with age. Lucas hesitated, but something deep within him, told him that he had to open it. He had to see what was inside. With a quick yank, he tore the lock off. It fell to the floor with a hollow thud, and the chest creaked open. Lucas sucked in a sharp breath as he peered inside. It was empty. But then something caught his eye, something small tucked into the corner. A piece of paper. He pulled it out and unfolded it carefully, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the writing on it was faded, but still legible. She will come for you. She always does. You can't hide from her. You can't escape her. The words sent a shiver down his spine. It was a warning, a threat. But from who? And why? Lucas's hand trembled as he held the paper. He glanced around the basement, his heart pounding. He felt like he was being watched, but there was no one else here. Just him and the eerie silence. Suddenly, a noise broke through the stillness. A door creaked open. Lucas froze. His heart skipped a beat. The sound had come from upstairs. It was the unmistakable creak of the front door. Someone was in the house. A chill ran down his spine as he slowly turned to face the stairs, every nerve in his body on high alert. The air seemed to grow thicker, suffocating him. He didn't dare move, his mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? The police? Or something worse? The door at the top of the stairs creaked again, followed by footsteps. Soft at first, but then growing louder, closer. Lucas's mind raced, panic bubbling to the surface. Should he go up and confront whoever it was? Or stay hidden, waiting for the right moment to make a move? The footsteps grew louder still, and then, suddenly, they stopped. Complete silence. It was like the person had vanished. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, too afraid to make a sound. His eyes flickered toward the basement door, now ajar, casting a sliver of light into the darkened room. Then the whispering started again. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But soon it grew louder, more urgent. The words were unintelligible, like a language Lucas had never heard before. The voice wasn't human, not in the way he understood it. It was guttural, raw, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the whispers grew louder, closer. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen in place. And then a figure appeared in the doorway. It wasn't a person. It was something else. A shadow, shifting and contorting as if it were made of darkness itself. Its form was indistinct, flickering in and out of existence like it didn't belong in the world at all. It stood there, staring at him with eyes that gleamed like black holes, sucking the light from the room. Lucas couldn't breathe. The whispering stopped. And then, from the silence came a voice, soft but cold, as if it was speaking directly into his mind. She's not the first, and she won't be the last. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Lucas's heart raced, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. But before he could react, the lights flickered once more, plunging the basement into darkness. And then it was gone. The room was empty again, silent once more. But Lucas could feel it, the weight of the presence that still lingered just out of sight. The fear that twisted in his gut. It wasn't over. This was just the beginning. With his hands shaking, he reached for the paper in his pocket and ran. He didn't look back. Lucas didn't stop running. His legs moved on their own, a blur of frantic motion as he tore through the darkened hallway, racing up the stairs as if the very ground beneath him was giving way. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them coherent. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat louder than the last as the cold air seemed to press down on him, suffocating him with an overwhelming sense of impending doom. What had he just seen? Was it real? Was it a hallucination? The thing in the basement, the shadow. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. He reached the front door, his fingers trembling as he fumbled with the lock, his breath ragged as panic flooded his veins. His mind was still reeling from the chilling encounter in the basement. The words that had been whispered, the thing in the darkness. It was all too much. But there was no time to process it, no time to think. He had to get out. He yanked the door open, the cold night air crashing into him like a wave. His eyes darted to the driveway, empty. The familiar surroundings of Amelia's house felt foreign now, a place filled with unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. Every noise, every creak of the house, every movement in the corner of his eye, sent his heart racing. He couldn't stay here. Not anymore. But as he stepped onto the porch, he froze. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with trembling hands, staring at the screen, confused. It was an unknown number. Hesitating, he answered. "Hello?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. A chilling laugh echoed through the phone. It was low, guttural, and strangely distorted, like it came from somewhere deep within the earth. Then came a voice, soft but unmistakable. "Lucas?" He froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The voice, it was Amelia's. But it wasn't the Amelia he knew. It was different, faint, distant, like it was being warped and twisted by something far more sinister. "What do you want from me?" Lucas choked out, barely able to speak. The laughter came again, this time louder, more menacing. "You'll understand soon enough," the voice hissed. "She's already chosen you." Before Lucas could respond, the call abruptly ended. The line went dead and the screen of his phone turned black. Lucas stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, unable to process what had just happened. His breath came in short gasps, his mind racing with questions. What had that meant? What had Amelia meant by "she's already chosen you"? And who had been on the other end of the phone? Was it really her? The phone buzzed again and Lucas almost dropped it in his panic. The same unknown number. "Hello?" he answered again, his voice shaking. There was no response. Just a low, eerie static that hummed in his ear, almost like a whispering voice buried deep within it. He pressed the phone tighter against his ear, trying to make sense of the static. And then he heard it. Faint at first, but then clearer. A name. Amelia? It was a whisper. Soft like a breath on the back of his neck. His heart pounded and his stomach churned. His mind raced, and his grip on the phone tightened as though the device was his only lifeline. What did it mean? Why was Amelia calling him? And why was the voice now calling her name in that same haunting whisper? He turned to face the house again, eyes wide with terror. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something held him there, something he couldn't name. The feeling in his gut, the sense of being pulled into something he couldn't escape, couldn't understand. And then, just as he turned to leave, he saw it. In the upstairs window of Amelia's house, something moved. A shadow flickered behind the curtains. Lucas's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a shadow. He could make out a shape, someone standing there. It looked like Amelia. His heart stopped. His body froze, unable to move. He stared at the window, barely able to breathe. The figure remained still, watching him from the darkness, the faint outline of a face peeking out from behind the curtains. And then, in the next instant, the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. The window was empty. But Lucas didn't wait. He couldn't. With panic clawing at his throat, he turned and ran. The night swallowed him whole, the darkness closing in on him as he sprinted down the driveway, not looking back, unable to look back. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness, the silence broken only by the pounding of his heart. As he ran, his thoughts were a jumble of confusion and terror. Amelia's voice, the whispering, the figure in the window. What was happening? Where was she? Why had she disappeared, and why had the house become alive? It was as if something in that house was drawing him in, pulling him closer to the nightmare that he was just beginning to understand. He had to get answers. But the deeper he went into the woods, away from the house, the more he felt the pull. It was like the house itself was calling him back. His phone buzzed again. This time the number was different. But Lucas didn't hesitate. He answered immediately, desperate for any explanation, any answer. This time there was no voice, just heavy breathing. And then the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. His heart lurched in his chest. He whipped around, his breath caught in his throat. Nothing. He was alone. Or at least he thought he was. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder. Someone, or something, was following him. He could hear it now, the crunch of leaves beneath heavy footsteps, coming closer, closing in. He turned again, his heart racing as he scanned the woods around him. He couldn't see anything, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming for him. Lucas ran faster now, pushing his body to its limits, the fear threatening to overtake him. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air stinging his lungs as he sprinted through the woods. The footsteps were getting closer, too close. His mind was a haze of terror and confusion, but one thought kept repeating in his head. Get away. Get away. And then a voice. Lucas? The whisper came from the trees, from somewhere in the darkness, but it wasn't a voice he recognized. It wasn't Amelia. It was something worse. And then everything went black. The world disappeared, swallowed by the dark. Lucas woke up in darkness, his head throbbing with pain. He groaned, trying to move, but his body felt heavy, as if trapped under some invisible force. His eyes flickered open, and the first thing he saw was an eerie red glow casting long shadows across the room. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind screamed at him to get up, to run, but his limbs refused to obey. He was lying on the cold, hard floor, his wrists bound tightly with thick rope, digging into his skin. Panic shot through him as he tugged desperately at the restraints, but they wouldn't budge. The fear gripped him tighter than the ropes ever could. Where was he? How did he get here? The air felt thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of something burning. Slowly, his mind started to piece together fragments of the night. Amelia's voice, the footsteps in the woods, the strange whispers, the face in the window. It was all real. The house, the shadows, the figure. He was no longer outside, no longer in the safety of the woods. He was back at the house. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Suddenly, a door creaked open, and the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the room. Lucas' heart skipped a beat as the darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. He could hear breathing, slow and steady, but it wasn't his own. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The footsteps stopped and Lucas' blood ran cold. A figure appeared from the shadows, its silhouette framed by the red glow. It was a woman, but not Amelia. It was a woman with hollow eyes, her skin pale as death, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. She stepped closer, her movements unnatural, jerky, as though her body wasn't entirely her own. Lucas couldn't look away, though every part of him screamed to turn, to run, to escape. "Do you know what's happening, Lucas?" Her voice was low and distorted, like a static-filled transmission. It was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, but there was no mistaking the eerie cadence of it. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, weak but determined. The woman's smile widened. "I am what you've been running from. I am the reason you can't escape. I am the reason Amelia isn't here anymore." Lucas' stomach twisted. Amelia? What had happened to her? His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of her words, but before he could speak, the woman took another step closer, her shadow consuming him entirely. "The house," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "It feeds on fear. It needs your fear to survive. And now you've given it everything it needs. You're the last piece of the puzzle, Lucas. The final sacrifice." His pulse quickened and panic surged through him. "No," he shouted, trying to jerk his arms free, but the ropes held fast. "What do you want from me?" The woman's eyes glinted with malevolent delight. "It's already too late for you. You're already part of the house now. And it's hungry?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Lucas felt a chill creeping into his bones. His breath became visible, condensing in the air, but it wasn't the cold that terrified him. It was the feeling, like something was watching him, something invisible just beyond his reach. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that danced around him like predators closing in on their prey. Suddenly, the woman lunged, her cold hands wrapping around his throat with unnatural strength. Lucas gasped, his body seizing in panic, the room spinning as he struggled to breathe. He tried to fight back, but it was no use. Her grip was too strong. His vision blurred as darkness crept into the edges of his sight. He was drowning, suffocating in that icy grip of terror. And then, just as his mind began to slip into unconsciousness, the woman leaned close to his ear, her breath cold against his skin. "You'll never leave," she whispered. "You'll never escape this house. It owns you now, Lucas. It's always going to own you." Her words echoed in his ears, filling him with dread that seemed to consume every ounce of his being. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the sound of her laugh, soft at first, then rising, twisting into something more monstrous, until it filled the room with a deafening, horrifying sound that felt like it was splitting him apart. When Lucas awoke again, he was no longer on the cold floor. He was lying in a bed, his arms still bound to the posts by thick, heavy chains. The red glow still filled the room, now pulsing rhythmically, like the beat of a heart. The shadows around him writhed, stretching and contorting like living things, moving with a life of their own. He turned his head slowly, fear coiling in his chest, and saw her again, the woman. But now she was different. Her eyes were wider, almost too wide, her smile too wide, too stretched, and her skin was cracking like dry clay. She wasn't just a woman anymore. She was something else entirely. Lucas' breath caught in his throat as he realized what she had become. "She's not the only one," the woman rasped, her voice now an eerie growl. "You're all just pieces in the game. All of you. And now that you're here, you'll never leave." The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in, the shadows whispering louder, until he couldn't hear anything but their voices. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw her, the figure that had been in the window. Amelia. But it wasn't Amelia. It was just a twisted reflection, an imitation of her. The real Amelia was gone. The house had taken her. It had taken them all. The woman stepped forward, her cracked smile never leaving her face. "Welcome home, Lucas. Welcome to your eternity." The lights flickered, and the room plunged into total darkness. And then there was nothing. The only sound that remained was the sound of footsteps, the sound of someone slowly, inevitably walking toward him. The house had won. Oh, you ever felt like someone was watching you, even though you were all alone? Imagine being in your own home late at night, when the air gets colder, the shadows stretch unnaturally long, and you hear faint whispers, but no one's there. What if it's not just your mind playing tricks? What if the shadows, aren't just shadows at all. Tonight, I'll tell you about Sophia, who thought she was safe in her own house. But something darker, something far more sinister, was waiting in the corners, and it had been there all along. Do you dare to find out what happens next? Sophia stood by the window, the light from the street lamp outside barely illuminating the empty road that stretched endlessly before her. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, the sudden drop in temperature making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was late, far later than she'd intended to stay up, but something about the night felt different. She had always been someone who appreciated solitude, who found comfort in the silence of her empty home. But tonight felt like something was off. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. A sharp gust of air seeped through the cracks, causing a shiver to run down her spine. Sophia stepped away from the window, feeling a sense of unease gnawing at her. She had been hearing strange sounds throughout the evening, whispers, soft scratching noises, as if something was moving around the house when it should have been completely still. The house had always been old, but tonight it felt older, as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing with a mind of their own. She shook her head, trying to push away the thoughts that crept into her mind, thoughts she couldn't shake off. After all, it was just the wind, wasn't it? But then, just as she turned to walk back toward the living room, she heard it again. A faint scratch, almost imperceptible, like something dragging against the floor. Sophia froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She had thought it was nothing, just the house settling, or maybe a tree branch scraping against the window. But this was different. This was deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt the instinctive pull of fear. She tried to dismiss it. It's just the house, she told herself. You're just tired. There's nothing here. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She walked cautiously toward the hallway, her steps tentative and slow. The darkness felt thicker now, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket, smothering the warmth of the light. She paused, scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just as she started to relax, a sudden noise broke the silence, louder this time. A low, guttural whisper, so close she could almost feel it against her skin. Her breath hitched as she turned sharply, her eyes darting around the room. It came from behind her. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the room was still empty. She was alone. Or at least that's what she told herself. Her mind raced, trying to explain away the noise. Maybe it's just the pipes, she thought. Maybe the house is just settling. Sold after all. But then a chill washed over her, colder than any breeze could have ever been. The whispers were louder now, and they weren't coming from the walls. No, this time they seemed to be coming from somewhere else. From behind the door. Sophia's eyes locked onto the old wooden door at the end of the hallway, the door to the basement. It had always been locked, she made sure of it. But tonight she swore she saw it move. Just a little, but enough to make her breath catch. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers were now clear, no longer just indistinct murmurs. They called her name. Sophia? Sophia? Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as the air around her grew colder still, her breath now visible in front of her face. She took a hesitant step forward, her pulse quickening. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to send a wave of dread crashing through her. She had never left it unlocked. She had never heard anything like this before. Was someone inside? Was there someone, or something, lurking in the dark behind that door? The whispers continued, growing more insistent, more frantic. The air felt thick with a presence that she couldn't see, but she could feel it. A weight pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She moved closer, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. It was cold, ice cold, like the metal had been frozen for hours. She couldn't stop herself. The whispers, they were calling her. They were waiting. With a sharp exhale, she twisted the knob and slowly pushed the door open. A gust of cold air hit her, and the room beyond was engulfed in shadows. But it was empty. The room was as she had left it, save for the feeling of something wrong. The darkness inside seemed to move, almost like it was alive, swirling and shifting as if something was waiting just beyond her sight. She stepped inside, every nerve in her body screaming for her to turn back. Her breath was shallow now, and her hands gripped the doorframe for support. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. A soft sound, almost like a faint tapping, echoed from somewhere in the room, drawing her attention to the far corner. It was there, something was there, someone perhaps, but all she could see was the shifting shadows. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She was trapped. The room was darker now, colder, and the whispers were louder than ever, coming from all directions. The shadows seemed to close in on her, pressing in from every angle. Sophia's breath quickened, her hands now shaking uncontrollably. Her mind raced as she desperately tried to find a way out, but there was no way out. Not anymore. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they seemed to be right next to her ear. They weren't just words anymore. They were a command, a demand. "Stay with us." Sophia screamed, her voice echoing through the room, but no one was there to hear. The shadows surrounded her, and the room grew colder, colder still. Then, everything went black. This chapter sets the tone for a psychological horror story, building suspense and dread, with the protagonist experiencing strange, unexplainable occurrences in her home. The tension escalates with each detail, keeping the audience on edge and asking the question, what's in the shadows? What's waiting for her in the dark? Sophia's eyes shot open, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The room was pitch black, the kind of dark that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Her hands reached out, frantically searching for something solid, anything to anchor her to reality. Her fingertips brushed against something cold and smooth. The wall. She was in the hallway. But how? Her mind raced, fragments of the night before crashing into her thoughts. The door. The whispers. The shadows. The thing in the corner of the room. Had it been a dream? Or was it real? She sat up, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wasn't sure how long she had been unconscious, but the feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. She glanced around the dark hallway, the faintest sliver of light from a distant street lamp filtering through the cracks of the window. But even that small light seemed weak against the overwhelming darkness that hung in the air. Get up, she told herself, willing her body to move, but her limbs felt heavy, almost as though they were made of lead. A cold sweat coated her skin as she struggled to find the strength to stand. Her mind was clouded, dizzy, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She wasn't alone. Something was watching her, waiting. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It was as if the house itself had become a breathing entity, alive and watching her every move. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. It's just in your head. It's just the house, she thought. But deep down she knew it wasn't. The house creaked again, this time louder. Not just the usual settling noises, it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from upstairs. Her breath hitched in her throat. No, she thought. There's no one else here. I'm alone. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to cooperate. She stayed frozen, listening to the soft shuffle of steps above her, each one closer than the last. Her mind flashed to the attic, a place she never ventured. It was small, barely used, with a door that hadn't been opened in years. And yet, that was the direction the footsteps were headed. Sophia's gaze darted nervously to the stairs leading up. Should she check? Should she run? What if it was just her imagination? But then the thought came to her, what if it wasn't? Every second seemed to stretch on for eternity as she debated her next move. The whispers from before seemed to come alive in her mind again, distant but insistent, stay with us, come closer. A sudden gust of wind howled through the cracks of the window, rattling the old frames. It startled her, and without thinking, she took a step forward toward the staircase, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The floorboards groaned under her weight, betraying her every move. She froze, her heart pounding as the steps above her stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her ragged breathing. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something. A shadow, long and twisted, moving slowly across the landing at the top of the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat. What was that? The shadow stretched, reaching out like a dark claw, and she froze again, her blood running cold. Her legs felt like jelly, her body paralyzed by the sight of whatever it was moving above her. No, this can't be happening. It's just the house, right? But her thoughts seemed to get lost in the thick air, suffocating under the weight of the presence that lingered just out of sight. She had to know. She had to find out what it was. Her body refused to move, but her mind overpowered her fears, and with a trembling hand, she reached for the stair railing. Another step. Her pulse thundering in her ears, the air thickening with every inch she moved. The stairs creaked loudly beneath her feet, and the shadow above her moved again, closer, as though it could sense her presence. She was almost at the top when she heard it, an almost imperceptible noise, a soft, breathy laugh. It echoed through the empty house like a distant memory, a sound that was both terrifying and somehow familiar. Sophia's eyes widened in horror. She knew that laugh. It was the voice from the night before, the voice that had whispered her name, the voice that had been in the dark, waiting for her. She wasn't alone. Something was here. Something was watching her. A flash of movement caught her eye. The door to the attic was ajar. Just slightly, but enough for her to see the shadows shift within. Her throat went dry. She had never gone up there. Her parents had warned her to stay away when she was younger. It's unsafe, they had said. It's full of old junk. She hadn't thought about the attic in years, but now it was calling to her. Its darkness pulled her in, the shadows whispering her name, beckoning her closer. Her heartbeat raced as she took a step toward the attic door, her hand reaching out for the cold handle. Just as her fingers brushed the knob, the door slammed shut with an ear-splitting crack. Sophia stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was in that room and they didn't want her to see. The entire house seemed to shift, the walls creaking in protest, the floorboards groaning beneath the weight of unseen footsteps. And then, silence. Sophia stood frozen at the top of the stairs, staring at the door that now felt more like a barricade than a simple piece of wood. Her heart beat wildly in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly, completely afraid. She wasn't imagining it. The house was alive and it wanted her to know it. The whispers grew louder again, now echoing in her ears like a chorus of voices. Sophia, come closer. Her legs shook with fear, and the air felt heavier with every passing second. The presence in the house was stronger now, a suffocating force that seemed to close in around her. She couldn't escape. Not this time. And as the shadow in the attic shifted once more, Sophia realized that there was no turning back. Whatever was waiting for her in that dark, abandoned space would soon make its presence known. Sophia's hand still gripped the cold, polished knob of the attic door. The silence in the house was deafening now, almost unnatural. She had never known a place so still. Every creak of the house, every shift of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed like an accusation, as if the house itself was silently judging her for what she was about to do. Her mind raced. She wanted to turn away, to flee the house, to pretend like nothing was happening. She could run out the door, down the street, and never look back. But something inside her, something deep and primal, kept her rooted to the spot. The whispers that had been creeping in the back of her mind now felt like a command, urging her forward. You have to know, you have to see. Sophia took a deep breath, her chest tightening as she twisted the knob. The attic door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, as though the house was unwilling to let her pass. At first there was nothing, just the dusty smell of old wood and the faintest scent of mildew. The light from the hallway barely reached the attic steps, casting the space above in deep shadows. The stairs stretched upward, narrow and steep, each step a challenge. But she wasn't about to back down now. Her body trembled, but her feet moved anyway, one step after another. The air grew colder with each movement, and she could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against her. By the time she reached the top, her breath was shallow and her heart was pounding in her ears. The attic was even more oppressive than she had imagined. The space was filled with boxes, old furniture, and forgotten items that had collected dust over the years. A few beams of moonlight filtered in through a small, grimy window, but the rest of the room was swallowed by darkness. As she stepped farther into the room, she noticed something odd. One of the boxes, a large, weathered one, sat slightly ajar. The lid was cracked open as though someone, or something, had been rifling through its contents. Sophia swallowed hard. She didn't know what she expected to find up here, old belongings, forgotten relics from a life long gone. But the unease that settled in her stomach told her that this wasn't a normal attic. This was a place where memories had been left behind, memories that didn't want to be remembered. Her gaze flickered around the room, looking for the source of the presence she could feel in the air. There was something here, something waiting in the corners of the room. And then she saw it, a small wooden rocking chair in the far corner. It was facing the wall, untouched by time, as though it had never been moved. But the seat of the chair was slightly rocking back and forth, though there was no breeze, no cause for movement. Sophia's throat tightened. Who moved the chair? Her mind screamed for her to leave, but her feet were glued to the floor. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the rocking chair. The movement, though slow and imperceptible, was like a magnet drawing her in. Her breath came out in shaky gasps as she stepped closer to it. The closer she got, the colder the air felt, until it was like the chill of death itself was pressing against her skin. She reached out a hand, and just as her fingers brushed the back of the chair, the door behind her slammed shut with a force that made the entire attic tremble. Sophia spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The room had suddenly become oppressively still again, and she could hear the sound of her own rapid breathing in the thick silence. What was that? She wasn't alone. Something had just shut the door, something that didn't want her to leave. Her mind screamed for answers, but all she could hear now were the whispers, louder than before, swirling in the shadows around her. "Stay with us, don't leave." She turned back to the chair. It had stopped rocking, but the stillness was worse somehow. She felt the weight of those unseen eyes on her, the feeling of being watched. The rocking chair seemed almost too still now, too quiet, as though it was waiting like everything else in the room for her next move. Sophia took another step forward, her pulse thundering in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that the room was shrinking, closing in around her. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. She could feel a presence now just behind her, something so close that it felt as though it was breathing on her neck. She whipped around, but the room was still empty. The only thing in the attic was her and the haunting silence. She took a step back, but her foot caught on something. She stumbled, and her hand shot out to steady herself, landing on a stack of boxes. The boxes shifted with a loud crash, and something heavy fell from the top. It was an old mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished with age. Sophia froze. The mirror lay face down on the floor, but something about it felt wrong. Her eyes were drawn to it, like a moth to a flame, and against her better judgment, she bent down to pick it up. As soon as her fingers touched the cool surface, a chill shot up her spine. The mirror felt unnaturally cold, and her breath caught in her throat. She turned it over, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her hair dark and tangled, and her eyes wide with terror. But it was the woman's mouth that sent a wave of nausea through Sophia's body. The woman's lips were moving, whispering words that Sophia couldn't hear, but the expression on her face said it all. It was a warning. Sophia's grip tightened around the mirror, her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to drop it, to run, but her body refused to obey. The whispering in her mind grew louder, more insistent. "Don't leave, don't leave." Her head snapped around, and for the first time she saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. But Sophia could feel its presence, cold and malevolent, like a black hole sucking all the warmth and light out of the room. Her legs trembled, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She knew she should run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It was as though it had been waiting for her all along, watching, listening, and now it had come for her. And then the whisper stopped. Everything fell silent. The figure moved. Sophia's pulse raced as it began to glide toward her, its movements unnaturally smooth, like a shadow drifting through the darkness. And in that moment she understood, it wasn't just the house that was alive. It was the thing in the corner, the thing that had been waiting for her all along. Sophia backed away, her mind frantic. She couldn't escape. She couldn't run. The air had become thick and suffocating, like she was drowning in it. The thing was getting closer, its presence oppressive, its form twisting and changing, but always moving toward her, as if it knew she was its next victim. And then it stopped. The air was still. Too still. Sophia's breath caught as the figure reached out with one long, pale hand, its fingers trembling as they brushed against her skin. Sophia stood frozen, her body paralyzed by the chilling sensation of cold fingers brushing against her skin. Every muscle in her body screamed for movement, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure in front of her, its shape flickering in and out of the darkness, was not human. It was something else. Something far older, far more malevolent. The hand, the one that had touched her skin, hovered just above her arm, its long bony fingers trembling with an unnatural energy. It moved with a sickening slowness, as though savoring the moment, enjoying her fear. Sophia's eyes widened in terror as the figure's face, if it could even be called a face, began to materialize from the darkness. The thing was tall, too tall for any normal human being, its face covered by a thick black veil of shadows. Yet there was something unervingly human about its features. The outline of eyes, a nose, a mouth, all blurred and indistinct, but undeniably there. It was watching her. It was waiting. Sophia's breath hitched as the creature's cold, breathless voice slithered into her mind, sending an icy shiver down her spine. "You're not supposed to be here, Sophia." Her pulse quickened, her heart thumping in her chest as the words echoed through her head. It was speaking to her, but its mouth hadn't moved. She could feel the pressure of its presence, an overwhelming force that filled the room and suffocated her thoughts. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But her body refused to obey. She could only stand there, her eyes locked onto the thing as it seemed to float closer, inch by agonizing inch. "Why did you come here?" The voice whispered again, this time sounding more like a breath than a word, rasping through the air around her. "Did you think you could escape?" Sophia's mind was racing. Escape? What was it talking about? She had come up to the attic out of curiosity, out of a need to understand what was happening to her. But now, standing in front of this thing, this creature that seemed to exist outside the rules of reality, she realized that she had no idea what she had truly stepped into. The figure reached out again, this time more forcefully, as if it was drawing her closer to it. Sophia could feel the pull, the invisible thread wrapping around her, tightening with every passing second. It was like the air itself was sucking her in, and she couldn't fight against it. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the creature hissed. "Now it's too late." Sophia's breath came out in ragged gasps, her pulse pounding in her ears. She was suffocating under the weight of its presence, the darkness closing in from every side. Her vision blurred as the room seemed to stretch, to twist, the walls expanding and contracting as if the house itself was alive and breathing. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take any more, the creature's fingers grazed her cheek. A surge of coldness, so intense it burned, coursed through her skin, and for a moment Sophia felt like she was being pulled apart at the seams. The pain was unbearable. Her entire body seemed to freeze in place, and for the briefest of moments she lost all sense of time, all sense of reality. The creature's grip on her mind tightened, and with it, the feeling of helplessness flooded her being. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out everything else. They weren't just in her head anymore. They were all around her, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everywhere. "You're ours now, Sophia." The words were clear now, no longer just whispers. They were a command, a binding decree, as though the very air around her had been shaped into this horrible truth. Sophia's eyes widened in panic. She had to break free. She had to escape. But how? Every instinct in her screamed at her to run, to find a way out, but the creature's hold on her was too strong. She had never felt so small, so powerless. But then, through the storm of fear and confusion, one thought cut through, clear and sharp. The mirror. The mirror she had picked up earlier. The one that had shown her the woman with the terrified eyes. The woman who had warned her. The woman who had been trapped here. Sophia's mind snapped to the mirror. It had been right in front of her. The creature was right there too, but she couldn't focus on it. Her gaze shot to the floor, and there, just behind her, lay the shattered mirror, pieces scattered across the attic floor. Without thinking, she staggered toward it, pushing past the suffocating darkness that clung to her like an invisible force. Each step felt like wading through thick tar, but she kept moving. She reached for the nearest shard of glass and lifted it in front of her. The moment the cold glass met her fingers, the whispers stopped. And then she saw it. The reflection. Not her own this time, but the figure from the corner of the attic. It stood still in the glass, as though it were trapped behind the surface. Its face twisted into a grotesque expression of rage, and for a split second she thought she saw it reach out toward her, its hand pressed against the mirror's surface. But it couldn't touch her. Not yet. The room seemed to breathe in time with her ragged gasps. Her eyes darted from the glass to the figure. It wasn't just watching her anymore. It was searching. It was looking for an opening, a way to escape, a way to cross the line from the reflection into the real world. Sophia's fingers trembled as she held the shard of glass before her, but she knew deep down that this was her only chance. If she didn't break the mirror, if she didn't do something now, she might never get out of the attic. She might never leave this place. But she couldn't just break it. The glass had to be shattered completely. Sophia steeled herself and hurled the mirror shard against the far wall, watching it explode into 1,000 tiny fragments. As the glass shattered, the creature let out a bone-chilling screech, its form flickering and distorting in the shards. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. For a moment, the attic was still. The figure was gone. The presence had lifted. But it wasn't over. Sophia's heart raced, and she turned toward the door, her legs finally finding the strength to move. She didn't dare look back. The only thing she knew was that she had to escape. She had to get out. As she stumbled down the stairs, the whispers started again, quiet at first but growing louder, closer, until they filled her mind. "You can't leave." And somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard that voice again. "It's not over." Sophia's heart was pounding in her chest as she stumbled down the narrow hallway, her breath ragged and shallow. The whispers had followed her, growing louder with each step, echoing in her mind like 1,000 tortured souls trapped within the walls. She could feel the oppressive weight of the house around her, like the air itself was thickening, suffocating her. It's not over. It's never over. The voice was clearer now. It wasn't just in her head anymore, it was all around her. The walls seemed to pulse with it, the shadows stretching out like fingers trying to grab hold of her. She was being watched, hunted, she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Every corner she turned, every door she passed, seemed to harbor more dark secrets, more dangers lurking just out of sight. She reached the front door and gripped the cold handle, only to find that it wouldn't budge. Her heart skipped a beat and panic surged through her veins. She pulled harder, her hands slipping on the metal as if it had been greased. No. The door wouldn't open. She turned frantically, her mind racing. There had to be another way out. She couldn't stay here. Not with that thing still lurking in the shadows. Not with those whispers growing louder, filling her ears, drowning her thoughts. As she turned away from the door, she caught a glimpse of movement at the far end of the hallway. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down her spine. She wasn't alone. Sophia's pulse quickened, and her breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen, watching the dark figure emerge from the shadows. It was tall, too tall, its form twisted and unnatural, like something that had been stitched together from darkness itself. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her, drilling into her soul. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling uncontrollably, but she couldn't look away. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Its presence filled the hallway, pushing against her, suffocating her with the heavy weight of dread. Then the whispering started again. This time it wasn't just a voice in her head. It was coming from the figure itself, a low, guttural rasp that sent her heart racing. "You can't escape, Sophia." The words wrapped around her like a vice, tightening, choking her. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as if she were drowning. The figure drew closer, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward her. "You were never meant to leave." Sophia's body trembled as she tried to crawl backward, but the floor beneath her seemed to stretch, the hallway growing longer with every inch she moved. It was as if the house itself was conspiring against her, trapping her in its endless maze. The figure's hand finally reached her, and the instant it touched her, her entire body went cold. She could feel the chill of its touch seeping into her skin, crawling beneath it, freezing her from the inside out. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was completely dry, the air thick and suffocating. She clawed at the floor, trying to pull herself away, but it was like the house was holding her in place, its dark energy wrapping around her like chains. The figure's grip tightened, and she felt a sudden jolt of pain, sharp, electric, coursing through her body. Her vision blurred as she fought to stay conscious, but it was becoming harder and harder to focus. "It's all over, Sophia." The whisper was louder now, deafening. The figure leaned closer, its form flickering and shifting as though it were made of shadows and smoke. She could feel its breath on her face, cold, rancid like death itself, and for a moment she thought she might pass out from the sheer terror of it all. But then something shifted. Something inside her snapped. With a burst of strength she didn't know she had, Sophia pushed herself off the floor, breaking free of the figure's grip. Her hand shot out, her fingers grazing the edge of the table beside her. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest object, anything she could use to defend herself, and swung it at the figure. It was a chair, its wooden legs heavy and solid. She slammed it into the creature's form, but it went right through it as if the figure was nothing more than smoke. "You cannot stop me." The words were a cold, mocking laugh in her mind, and the figure's form twisted and writhed like liquid shadow, reforming itself as she watched. Her heart raced, her panic reaching a fever pitch. She wasn't getting out. She wasn't going to make it. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. The world around her seemed to shift and distort, like the house itself was folding in on itself. She could feel the walls pressing in, the ceiling low above her, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The shadows seemed to come alive, swirling, dancing around her like living things, closing in on her from every side. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The figure was gone. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The oppressive weight of the house lifted, and Sophia could finally breathe again. Her pulse still raced, but the terror that had filled her chest moments before was replaced with confusion. What just happened? Had she imagined it? Had the creature been real? Or was this all some twisted illusion her mind had conjured to make sense of the madness that was unfolding? She looked around frantically, her eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a bad dream. Sophia's thoughts raced. She needed to find a way out. She needed to get out of the house, out of this nightmare. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The door. It was wide open. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. How had she not noticed it before? Had the door always been open? Had it somehow unlocked itself when she wasn't looking? Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped toward it, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. With every step, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the air heavier, as if the house itself was alive, waiting for her to make the wrong move. And as she stepped through the doorway, she heard it again. The whisper. "Welcome home, Sophia." Sophia's pulse hammered in her ears as she stepped through the open door, the cold air biting at her skin. The street outside looked eerily familiar, yet everything felt off, like she had stepped into a warped version of the world she had once known. The buildings were too silent, the wind too still. It was as if the entire town had been swallowed by a thick, unnatural fog. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see the shadowy figure looming in the doorway, but it was gone. The house was dark, its windows like lifeless eyes watching her, waiting. The whispers were quieter now, distant, but they still clung to the air around her, a reminder that something had followed her, something that wouldn't let her go. Sophia stumbled down the empty street, her footsteps echoing louder than they should in the dead silence. The wind had stopped completely, and not a single leaf stirred in the trees. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. Then she heard it. A voice, distant but unmistakable, calling her name. Sophia. Her breath caught in her throat and she stopped dead in her tracks. She knew that voice. It was familiar. It was the voice of someone she once trusted. Someone who had been with her in this town. Someone who had disappeared years ago. She turned around, scanning the street, but there was no one there. Only the empty, desolate town. But the voice came again, closer this time. Sophia, I'm here. I never left. Her heart thudded in her chest as she began to walk backward, the fear mounting with every step. Her mind was racing. Who was calling her? Who was speaking to her from the darkness? Was it real? Was it a trap? She didn't know how long she had been walking, but the town was beginning to feel more and more unfamiliar, like it was shifting around her. The buildings had changed, their outlines distorted, as if they were slowly bending and reshaping. The streets twisted unnaturally, leading her in circles, and the further she walked, the more the air grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence. The voice was now behind her, close, too close. She spun around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling, but the only reply was the eerie sound of wind whispering through the empty streets. But then she saw it. A figure standing in the distance, just beyond the haze, barely visible against the fog. At first, she thought it might be her imagination, an illusion created by her panicked mind. But as the figure grew clearer, Sophia's blood ran cold. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He was standing still, motionless, staring directly at her with eyes she couldn't see but could feel. There was something wrong about him, something unnatural, like he didn't belong here. Sophia's body froze. The voice that had called her name, sounded again, but this time it was clearer, louder. "You shouldn't have left," the voice said, the words lingering in the air, thick with malice. Sophia's legs felt weak beneath her, her body torn between running and confronting whatever was out there. She felt like she had no choice. The figure's presence was suffocating, drawing her in like a magnetic force she couldn't escape. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, desperate for a sign, a signal. Maybe she could call for help. Maybe someone would be able to pull her out of this nightmare. But when she unlocked it, the screen flickered. It was as though the phone was malfunctioning, its image distorted, glitching in and out, and before she could even react, the phone went black. Sophia gasped, panic flooding her system. She tried turning the phone on again, but nothing happened. The figure stepped forward, and the fog seemed to close in around her. Every step he took, the air grew colder. She could feel the weight of his gaze, his presence like an anchor dragging her deeper into whatever twisted world she had stumbled into. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to move, but her feet were rooted to the ground, frozen. She could see his face now, barely visible beneath the hood, and it made her stomach turn. It wasn't a face. It was a blank void. A dark, empty space where features should have been, as if the figure itself had no true identity. No past. No soul. Just a hollow shell. "You never left, Sophia," the voice repeated, but it was no longer coming from the figure. It was all around her, in her ears, in her head, in the very air she breathed. You are still here. We are all still here. You can't escape. Her mind was spiraling. The world around her seemed to fold in on itself. The buildings stretched, bending like rubber, distorting in impossible ways. The ground under her feet cracked open, a deep chasm forming, pulling at her with a magnetic force. The fog was closing in on her, too thick to see through, suffocating her. The whispers returned, louder than ever, all speaking at once. Sophia couldn't breathe. She was choking on the overwhelming weight of their words, their accusations, their judgment. The figure stepped closer, reaching for her with hands that seemed to dissolve into the air as they came closer. She tried to scream, but the words were stuck in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't fight back. You're part of this now, the voice said. You belong to us. In a final, desperate attempt, Sophia closed her eyes, clutching her hands to her ears, trying to block out the maddening sound. But it was too late. The ground beneath her feet cracked wide open and she fell into darkness. Sophia's fall seemed endless. The dark abyss consumed her, pulling her deeper into the void. Her senses were overloaded. Her heart raced, her lungs burned, and her mind was trapped in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The silence was deafening, heavier than the darkness itself. She was spiraling, falling faster, deeper, farther than she had ever imagined possible. Every twist of her body felt like a violation of nature, like the ground beneath her was disintegrating, and she was nothing more than a helpless puppet in the hands of an unseen force. The sensation of falling was gone. Her body stopped abruptly, like hitting an invisible wall, and she stumbled forward onto solid ground. But there was no floor beneath her, no walls around her. She was alone in an empty, sterile white space, floating, suspended, disconnected from reality. The air was thick, suffocating. Her every breath felt like it was strangled at its core. For the first time since all of this began, Sophia felt the weight of her thoughts, the overwhelming weight of knowing she couldn't escape. She was trapped, somewhere between the real world and the twisted nightmare she had somehow become part of. The white room, if it could even be called that, felt like a blank slate waiting for her to fill it with something, anything. But she had no power here. She was just a pawn in someone else's game. Then the voice returned. Did you think you could outrun the truth? It whispered, its tone now unnervingly calm. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. This voice, it was hers. The voice that had once been her own, a reflection of her deepest thoughts, her fears, her darkest desires. It had been taunting her, guiding her, tricking her. Her mind raced as the realization settled in. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, I'm not part of this. I didn't ask for this. But the voice laughed, low and cruel, reverberating around her. It echoed in the empty space, bouncing off the walls that weren't there, and wrapped itself around her like a suffocating blanket. You were always part of this, it said. From the moment you crossed the line, when you thought you could escape, you sealed your fate. It's not a matter of running away anymore, Sophia. There is nowhere left to hide. Sophia clutched her head, her hands shaking as the weight of the truth crushed down on her. She had thought it was an outside force, something beyond her, something that had taken control of her life, her thoughts, her actions. But it wasn't. She had allowed it to take root in her. She had welcomed it. In every moment of doubt, in every whisper of fear, she had called it in, opened the door to this madness herself. She was the one who had created it. The room around her began to shift, contort into something more familiar, more terrifying. The walls cracked open, revealing twisted, distorted versions of everything she had left behind. Her home, her friends, her family. They were all there, but something was wrong with them. Their faces were hollow, their eyes black and lifeless, their smiles twisted in grotesque mockery. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as much as she wanted to turn away, to deny it all, the figures grew closer, their hollow eyes staring into her soul. Their faces whispered things she couldn't hear, but she could feel the dread crawling under her skin. You've ignored us for too long, they murmured, their voices blending into one. You can't outrun the things you've done. Sophia shook her head furiously, trying to block them out. No, you're not real. None of this is real. But they weren't listening. They kept coming, their hollow faces closing in, the distorted shadows of her past suffocating her. This was her punishment. A flash of light erupted from the corner of her vision, blinding her, and Sophia shielded her eyes instinctively. When she opened them again, she found herself standing in front of a cracked mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her face that she saw. The face in the mirror was older, wearied, hollow-eyed, just like the faces she had seen before. It was twisted with an expression she hadn't seen on her own face before. Fear, regret, guilt, and, most chilling of all, acceptance. The reflection grinned at her, that twisted, mocking smile widening as she stared in horror. "No," she whispered. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was loud. It was real. "You can never escape yourself, Sophia. You brought this upon yourself. The moment you crossed the line, it was already over. It's all you, Sophia. You are the darkness." The mirror shattered. Pieces of glass flew everywhere, and Sophia was left standing in the middle of a void, the sound of the breaking glass echoing around her. The darkness closed in. Sophia's scream was drowned out by the sound of her own heartbeat, echoing in the silence. And then it was gone. The space, the voices, the faces. She was alone. But as the last fragment of her mind flickered in the silence, she understood. There was no escape. Not for her. Not for anyone who had crossed the line. The darkness would always find them. James stood alone in the empty house, the silence pressing in on him like a suffocating blanket. Every creak of the old wood beneath his feet seemed too loud, too deliberate, as if the house itself was alive, watching him. The air was thick with something unsettling, like a cold breath just over his shoulder, but when he turned, nothing was there. He brushed it off, his rational mind telling him it was just the house settling. But then he heard it again, a soft whisper, faint but clear, "James." He froze, heart hammering in his chest. There was no one else here. Was there? What would you do if the house you thought you knew started hiding its secrets from you? James had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm in any situation. As a young, practical man, the world's fears and anxieties never seemed to touch him. He'd faced all kinds of challenges, deadlines, arguments, traffic jams, but nothing compared to this. Nothing had ever felt quite like this. It was a Tuesday when James received the call. His Aunt Sophia, who had always been distant yet supportive, had passed away. The old house on Maple Street, where she had lived for decades, was left to him. Despite the overwhelming sense of loss, James knew he had a responsibility to handle her estate. He had no choice but to go to the house. The first time he laid eyes on it, he hesitated. It wasn't the house that unnerved him, it was the way it seemed to stare back at him. A large, two-story colonial house with windows that were both inviting and ominous at the same time. The ivy clung to the brick like old memories, and the front door, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon him in. Shaking off the unease, James pushed the door open. The smell of dust and mildew hit him immediately. The house hadn't been lived in for years, but it had been cared for, and everything looked untouched, as if frozen in time. He stepped in, his footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. He looked around, noting the thick curtains that blocked out the sunlight and the dim furniture covered in sheets. "Welcome home." The voice came from nowhere, yet it was unmistakably clear. James froze, his chest tightening. He whipped his head around. No one was there. The house felt oppressive, the silence almost deafening, but the voice wasn't the only thing that unsettled him. It was the way the air in the house seemed to shift with him. Every time he moved, there was a slight change, a coldness that followed. He figured it was just the house's age, drafty, full of creaks and moans. But the more he explored, the more the strange feelings gnawed at him. He made his way to the living room, where the fireplace loomed like a forgotten altar. Old photographs lined the mantel, black and white portraits of people who looked like they had stepped out of another era. His aunt, younger and smiling, stood in several of the photos, her eyes strangely intense for such a gentle woman. There was one picture, however, that caught his attention. His Aunt Sophia standing next to a man James didn't recognize. His face was slightly blurred, as though the photo was purposely defaced. His eyes, though, were sharp, piercing, as if they could see through James. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, startling him out of his thoughts. James spun around, his heart racing. It had come from the direction of the attic. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. This was all just the house settling. He started toward the stairs, his feet dragging slightly as he ascended. The stairs creaked under his weight as if the house was complaining. The landing at the top of the stairs was dim, and James reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered once before completely going out. The darkness seemed to swell, and a sense of dread settled in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. He glanced down the hallway where the door to the attic sat, closed and locked. A faint, ghostly glow emanated from beneath it, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. James' curiosity pulled him forward, and despite the pit that had formed in his stomach, he approached the door. As he touched the handle, the temperature in the hallway dropped. His breath came out in a visible puff. He turned the knob, but the door didn't budge. Locked. He frowned, taking a step back. How could it be locked? He didn't remember his aunt having any locks on the attic. His thoughts raced. A low hum began to vibrate through the walls, like a distant voice trying to break through. The sound grew louder, and with it, a wave of nausea swept over him. He stumbled backward, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. And then, silence. The hum stopped as abruptly as it had started. But the silence was thick, too thick, like the house was holding its breath. James stood there, staring at the locked door, wondering if it was all in his head. Just a trick of the old house. And then, from the corner of the hallway, he heard it. A whisper. Soft, but unmistakable. James? His heart skipped a beat. He jerked his head to the side, but the hallway remained empty. The darkness seemed to grow deeper, swallowing the light from the distant lamps downstairs. His body froze, every instinct screaming at him to leave. The house creaked again, and this time it didn't sound like the wind. The whisper came again. James? But this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was closer, almost in his ear. James spun around, his chest tightening. There was no one there. The door to the attic was still locked, still sealed, but the whisper was unmistakable. He wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a chill running down his spine. The question nagged at him like a splinter under his skin. Was the house really just settling? Or was something else living inside? James felt his heartbeat in his throat as he turned to walk back down the stairs. But as he descended, the whisper followed him, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. James? He rushed down the steps, his mind in a whirlwind. What was happening? Was it his mind playing tricks on him? Or was there something more sinister in this house? The whisper haunted him, echoing through his thoughts as he reached the bottom of the stairs. He rushed out the front door, his legs shaking with every step. The evening air was cool, the kind of crispness that should have been refreshing, but it only made his skin crawl. The house behind him seemed to breathe with a life of its own. He looked back once more before getting into his car, but the windows stared back at him, empty, silent, as if it had never been alive at all. But James couldn't shake the feeling that the house was waiting, and something inside was calling his name. James hadn't expected to return to the house so soon, but something inside him, something dark and unexplainable, had pulled him back. The moment he stepped through the threshold, the air felt different. He could feel it like a heavy blanket draped over him, pressing in on all sides. He glanced around, but the house was as it always had been, silent, still, and cold. Yet a knot formed in his stomach. Something had changed. The silence was oppressive. Not a sound except the faint creak of the old floorboards beneath his boots. He slowly made his way through the house, each step heavier than the last. His heart raced as his eyes darted to the corners of the room, half expecting to see shadows moving on their own. And then he heard it, a soft whisper. James froze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to listen, but the sound was gone. He stood there for a moment, waiting, but nothing came. Maybe it was just the house settling. Or the wind, he reasoned. But as he continued his trek through the dimly lit hallway, the whispers returned, growing louder with each step. James? The voice was soft, like a faint breath against his ear. It sent a cold shiver down his spine. He spun around, expecting to find someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. There was no one. The house had always felt strange to him, but now it felt alive, watching him, listening to him. He moved toward the stairs, his body tense, every nerve on edge. The floor creaked under his weight, each step echoing in the thick silence. His hand brushed the banister, and a wave of unease washed over him. His aunt had always warned him about the attic, the one room in the house that was never to be opened. She had warned him, but now here he was. The attic door beckoned. He reached for the doorknob, hesitated, and then turned it. The door opened with a long, drawn-out groan, the hinges protesting. A gust of cold air rushed down the stairs, making James shiver. Inside, the attic was dark, so dark that even the faint light from the hallway barely illuminated it. The space was filled with old furniture, boxes, and what appeared to be layers of dust untouched by time. There was a sense of abandonment, yet something felt off. His eyes scanned the room, drawn to a corner where a large old chest sat, locked tight. But it wasn't just the chest that caught his attention. It was the feeling, the oppressive weight of something watching him. He could feel the eyes on him, though no one was there. Then, as if from nowhere, the whisper came again, closer this time. "James, why did you come back?" He spun around, his heart pounding. The attic was still empty. Panic rose in his chest. He wanted to leave, but something held him there, like an invisible force pulling him deeper into the room. He couldn't explain it. Something in his gut told him that he needed to find out what had happened in this house, what secret his aunt had kept hidden for so long. He forced himself to approach the chest. The whisper had stopped, but the silence was far more unsettling now. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, every flutter of a distant door sounded deafening. He knelt before the chest, his hands trembling as he traced the old brass lock. Something clicked inside his mind. The key. The key his aunt had kept in a drawer, hidden in plain sight, was now in his hand, and he knew he had to open it. But why? What had driven him to this moment? What had pulled him back here? He inserted the key and turned. Click. The chest opened with a creak, the sound like the groan of a long-forgotten memory being awoken. Inside there were old papers yellowed with age. James pulled them out, his hands shaking, and began to sift through them. They were letters, mostly unreadable due to their age. But one thing stood out, the name. A name that had haunted him in his dreams for weeks. Sophia. His aunt's name. As he flipped through the pages, a photograph slipped out. James took it carefully, his pulse quickening as he looked at it. It was a photo of his aunt, but she was much younger, standing next to a man who looked vaguely familiar. A man with hollow, empty eyes and a smile that seemed wrong. He froze, staring at the photo. Something wasn't right. The man in the photograph, it was him. The same man who had appeared in his dreams. But why? Why was he in the attic? Before he could process the shock, the air around him grew thick, suffocating. The temperature plummeted and his breath turned to mist. The walls seemed to close in around him. The shadows stretched long and dark, twisting in the corners of the room. The whisper returned, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple voices, all speaking at once, overlapping until they became a cacophony in his ears. "James, help me. Don't leave me. Why did you come back?" His heart raced. The whispers were all around him now, suffocating, overwhelming. He looked up, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, something shifting in the darkness. But no, it was just the shadows. The chest slammed shut with a loud bang, and James stumbled backward, his heart racing. His skin crawled with fear as he scrambled to his feet. The door to the attic had closed. He hadn't heard it move, but it was shut, trapping him inside. The room was closing in. He could feel it. He wasn't alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, so suffocating, that James could feel his sanity slipping. He ran for the door, his hands shaking as he pulled on the knob. But it wouldn't budge. He was trapped, and something was waiting for him. James' heart was hammering in his chest as he pulled at the attic door with all his strength. It didn't budge. Panic gripped him, and for a brief, dizzying moment, he wondered if this was the end, if this house, this cursed place, had claimed him too. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The darkness in the attic seemed to press in on him, suffocating, and the air was cold, unnaturally cold. The floor beneath him creaked, and he spun around, half expecting to see the shadows shift. But nothing moved. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the voices. It was heavy, oppressive, like something was waiting just out of sight. James backed away from the door, his pulse quickening. He had to find another way out, but there was nowhere to go. The attic was small, cluttered with old furniture, dust-covered boxes, and forgotten relics of the past. The air smelled of mildew and age. His foot caught on something, an old wooden chair left carelessly against a table. It tipped over with a loud crash that echoed through the room. His eyes darted around again, scanning the room for any sign of movement. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. James whipped around, his heart skipping a beat. The room was still empty. His mind was playing tricks on him, or maybe it was the house, the dark, or something far worse. But no, there it was again. Soft, deliberate footsteps, faint but unmistakable. His body went rigid, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. The words hung in the air, but no answer came. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe it was the house settling, the wind shifting through the broken windows. But then the whisper returned, this time sharper, closer, directly in his ear. "James?" He froze, unable to move. The voice was like ice, sending chills racing through his body. He spun around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. And yet, the presence lingered. James' eyes locked on the corner of the room, where a large, dusty mirror hung crookedly on the wall. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it drew him in like a magnet. Something about it felt wrong. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching further as he took a step toward the mirror. The air around him thickened, the silence broken only by the sound of his own breathing, now ragged and shallow. He reached the mirror, his fingers brushing the cool glass. The reflection staring back at him was his own, but not entirely. The edges of his face appeared blurred, distorted, as though something was trying to claw its way out from behind him. His pulse spiked as he saw it, something in the reflection moving just out of sight. A figure. The figure was tall, its form shrouded in darkness. James could barely make out its shape, but there was no mistaking the feeling it gave him. It was watching him, standing just behind him, but when he turned around there was nothing there. His heart raced as he spun back to the mirror. The figure was closer now, its face barely visible. Hollow eyes. A twisted grin. He stumbled backward, falling against a chair. The room seemed to spin around him, as if reality itself were warping. The figure in the mirror moved closer, its features becoming clearer, more defined. James reached out, his hand shaking uncontrollably as he touched the glass. The figure mimicked his every move, its grin widening with every twitch of his fingers. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was no longer mimicking him. The figure's mouth opened impossibly wide, and it whispered something that sent a wave of cold fear crashing over James. "You're not alone." The whisper didn't come from the mirror. It came from behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the footsteps gone, and the silence unbearable. His breath came in ragged bursts as he stumbled toward the door again, trying desperately to turn the handle. But it still wouldn't budge. The air was thick with the presence of something just beyond his reach. He could feel it now. Something in the shadows, something that had always been there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls pressed tighter and tighter until he could barely breathe. He slammed his shoulder against the door, throwing all his weight into it, but it was useless. And then the whispers returned, louder, closer. "James, you should have stayed away." The words were like ice, chilling him to his core. His vision blurred as the room seemed to twist and distort, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling around him. The shadows, once static, began to move. They seemed to stretch and grow, crawling along the walls and floor, reaching for him. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows reached out, curling around his feet, pulling at him with cold, unyielding fingers. His breath caught in his throat as he fought against the darkness, but it was too strong. It was everywhere, wrapping around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. "Help!" he gasped, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The shadows closed in on him, their cold touch seeping into his skin, his bones. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with the terrible truth. He wasn't going to make it out. The last thing James saw before everything went black was the figure from the mirror, its hollow eyes staring at him, its twisted grin stretching wider. And then there was nothing. James' eyes fluttered open, his vision blurry, the world around him spinning. His mouth felt dry, and a faint taste of iron lingered on his tongue. He was no longer in the attic. The oppressive darkness had been replaced by an eerie, dim light, and the air felt thick, like it was laced with something unnatural. He groaned and sat up, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. How had he gotten here? The last thing he remembered was the relentless darkness closing in on him, the cold touch of the shadows, the whispers in his ear. Now, he was lying on the floor of a narrow hallway, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The air smelled musty, like years of neglect, mixed with a faint, metallic scent that he couldn't place. He staggered to his feet, the floor creaking beneath his weight. The hallway stretched out before him, long and uninviting, disappearing into the shadows at either end. James' heart pounded in his chest, his every instinct screaming at him to run, to get out of this place. But his legs wouldn't move. They felt like lead, each step a battle against some invisible force. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the hallway. Something was off. The silence was deafening, and yet he could hear faint sounds, almost like whispers, echoing from the walls, from the very air itself. They were distant, but James could feel them tugging at his mind, drawing him in. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the light flickering above him, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. It was as though the house was alive, breathing, waiting. "James?" The whisper cut through the silence, its voice low and chilling. His name. Again. James froze, his blood running cold. The voice seemed to come from every direction, circling him, closing in. His breath hitched and he felt the panic rising in his chest. The echoes of his name bounced off the walls, growing louder and louder, until they were all he could hear. He turned to face the hallway once more, trying to shake off the feeling that something was following him. But when he looked down, he saw it. His own footprints. The ground beneath him was a smooth, dark wood, but the footprints that marked the floor were wrong. They were out of place, not just his, but others. Faint outlines of shoes, impressions of soles, trailing off in the direction he had just come from. James stepped back, his heart thudding in his chest. Had someone else been here before? Or was it him? The thought made his stomach churn. He had to get out. He turned toward the end of the hallway, the whispers growing louder, more urgent, as if they were guiding him somewhere. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with each step. Suddenly the whispers stopped. A sharp, unsettling silence replaced them, like the entire world was holding its breath. James' skin prickled. He had crossed the threshold of some unspoken boundary, and now there was no turning back. He pressed forward, each step echoing loudly in the stillness. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar, the light from within spilling out into the dark corridor like a beacon. James hesitated. Something about the door felt wrong. It called to him, but it also repelled him. It was as though whatever lay behind that door had been waiting for him, for a long time. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know. He had to find out what was happening, why this house felt so alive, so full of secrets. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling as he grasped it. The moment his fingers touched the cool metal, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They were no longer words, but voices, agonized, pleading, screaming, all overlapping, all desperate. He yanked the door open. Inside was a room, but not like any room he had ever seen. It was a small, dimly lit space, filled with old furniture, the air thick with dust. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing away from him, and a mirror, just like the one in the attic, hung crookedly on the far wall. As his eyes scanned the room, he noticed something on the floor. Blood. It pooled beneath the chair, dark and fresh. The room smelled like death. The walls were lined with old photographs, their faces blurred and distorted, their eyes following him as he stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. James spun around, his heart racing. And then he saw it. In the reflection of the mirror. His own face, but not like before. This time his face was different. His eyes were hollow, empty, and his lips were twisted into a sickening grin, one that wasn't his own. He stumbled backward, a surge of terror flooding his chest. The reflection in the mirror began to move, its grin widening, its eyes never leaving James. James, the voice whispered again, but it wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from the chair. The figure in the chair shifted. Slowly, deliberately. James' blood ran cold as the figure stood up, the creaking of the chair echoing in the silent room. It was a woman. But her face was a mask of raw, red, pulsing flesh, with no features, no eyes, just a gaping void where a face should be. James, the voice came again, this time from the figure itself. It stepped toward him, its movements slow, unnatural, like it was learning how to walk. James backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to escape. He had to. The figure lunged at him. Everything went black. James awoke with a violent start, his body stiff, his head pounding. The air felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on him, and the faint smell of blood lingered in his nostrils. His heart raced as his eyes darted around the room. He wasn't sure where he was. The world felt distorted, like a dream that had gone horribly wrong. The coldness of the floor beneath him snapped him back to reality. He was lying on his back, staring up at the ceiling. He tried to move, but something held him down, an unseen force, like invisible chains wrapped tightly around his limbs. Panic surged through him. His breath quickened. What's happening? The room was dark, barely illuminated by the dim light from a broken window. The air smelled stale, the walls cracked and peeling. The door he had passed through moments ago was gone. There was no way out, no way back. He strained against the invisible force that bound him, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as though the house itself had become his prison. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence, a low, dragging noise. It was faint at first, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, but it was growing louder, closer. James' heart skipped a beat. The sound was coming from behind him. He twisted his head to look, but all he could see were the shadowy outlines of old furniture, the outlines of something in the corner of the room. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, stretching and growing as if they had a life of their own. The sound grew louder still. A soft voice broke the silence. James? His name. Again. James' heart slammed in his chest. The voice sounded so close, but when he looked around, there was no one there. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The shadow in the corner moved. His body tensed, every muscle screaming in terror. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He wanted to run, but he couldn't move. The shadow in the corner began to shift, slowly, like it was gathering itself. And then it emerged from the darkness, a figure. A man, tall and thin, his features distorted and blurred as if he were made of darkness itself. His face was indistinguishable, a mass of shifting shadows that seemed to leak into the air around him, never settling. The figure took a step forward. James could feel his pulse in his ears, a frantic rhythm that threatened to drown out the world. He strained against the invisible force holding him, but it was futile. His body refused to obey. The figure continued to approach, each step deliberate, each movement heavy with malice. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as though the very presence of this entity was freezing everything it touched. Then the figure spoke, his voice a soft rasping sound that echoed through the room. James? The way he said his name made James' blood run cold. It wasn't the voice of a person. It was something else. Something wrong. The figure reached out with one hand, its fingers elongated and twisted, like they were made of shadow itself. It hovered inches from James' face, and as it did, James could feel the air around him grow even colder. The room seemed to contract, closing in on him. James struggled with everything he had left, but his body refused to obey. He couldn't escape. The figure's fingers brushed against his cheek. A shock of coldness surged through James' body, spreading from the point of contact like ice flooding his veins. He gasped for air, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The figure's touch was suffocating, like it was pulling the life from him. His vision blurred. His skin felt like it was burning, but at the same time, freezing. And then he heard it again. The whisper. It wasn't the figure's voice. It wasn't the voice he'd heard in the attic or in the hallway. This voice was different. It was a child's voice. Help me, James? James' heart pounded in his chest. He tried to turn his head to look at the source of the voice, but the room was closing in, the walls pressing against him. The shadows were alive, shifting and writhing, crawling toward him. The voice came again, more desperate this time. Please, help me. Who are you? James managed to choke out, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it simply watched him, its eyes hidden in the swirling mass of shadows that made up its face. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if time itself was bending around him. Then the shadows in the corner of the room stirred. A second figure emerged from the darkness. It was a child, or at least it looked like a child. A little girl, her face pale and twisted in agony. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and empty. She stepped forward, her feet making no sound on the floor. Her hands were outstretched, reaching for him. The temperature dropped even further. James could barely breathe. The girl's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood through him. This wasn't a child. It couldn't be. There was something wrong with her. Her lips parted, and in a voice that sounded far too old for her frail body, she whispered, "He can't help you. He's already part of it." The words hit James like a physical blow, sending a chill down his spine. His entire body froze, paralyzed by fear. The figure, the shadowed man, moved closer, his hand stretching out once more. But this time, something was different. James could feel it. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was something worse. It was suffocating. It was the darkness itself, creeping into his chest, wrapping around his heart, tightening its grip with every breath he took. He tried to scream, to move, but his body wouldn't listen. The child's laughter echoed in the room, distorted and eerie, like 1,000 voices woven together. And in that moment, everything went dark. The last thing James felt was a hand, cold, dead, and suffocating, pressing against his chest. And then silence. James awoke to darkness. At first, he thought he was still trapped in the same nightmare. The cold was unbearable, the silence suffocating. His head throbbed violently, his vision spinning as if the world itself had been turned upside down. He tried to move, but his body was stiff, his limbs locked in place. He could barely feel his hands or feet, as though they were miles away from him. Was he still in the room? Was he still trapped in that same house, surrounded by the twisted shadows? The thought made his stomach turn. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. but he didn't know how. His breathing was shallow, the air thick with a dampness that clung to his skin. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he forced himself to sit up. His vision cleared a little and he realized something. He wasn't in the room anymore. The walls were gone. He was in a vast, empty space, an expanse of nothingness stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see. There were no floors, no walls, no windows. Just blackness. Endless blackness. James' pulse quickened. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone. He tried to move, to stand, but his body felt weak and disconnected, like it wasn't even his own. His breath quickened, panic rising in his chest. Where was everyone? Where was the child? Where was the figure? The shadows? Hello? He called out, his voice trembling, barely a whisper in the vast emptiness. No answer. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, and started walking. The cold ground beneath him felt like a void, devoid of any warmth, any life. He couldn't hear anything. No footsteps. No sound of his breathing. It was as if the very air was dead. He walked for what felt like hours, though he couldn't be sure. Time didn't seem to exist here. Everything was disorienting. His surroundings never changed, no matter how far he went. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw something in the distance. A faint light. It was a soft glow, like the light of a dying candle, flickering in the distance. Hope surged in James' chest, and he quickened his pace, desperate to reach the source of the light. But with every step he took, the light seemed to move farther away, teasing him. It was like it was just beyond his reach, always just out of his grasp. James' heart pounded. The fear that had been gnawing at the edges of his consciousness began to grow, spreading through him like a poison. The whispers returned. Soft at first, barely audible, they drifted on the wind, if that was even what this place had. The voices were indistinct, a low murmur that seemed to rise from the very air around him. He couldn't make out the words, but they were there, creeping at the edge of his hearing, pulling him in. James? He froze. That voice. He knew that voice. James? It was clearer now, and it came from all around him, echoing in the emptiness. The light flickered again, this time brighter, and for a moment, it seemed to pulse with something alive, something watching. He couldn't stop himself now. His body moved toward the light, drawn by an invisible force. It was like gravity, except it wasn't pulling him down. It was pulling him in. The whispers grew louder, closer, more urgent. James, you don't understand? His mind raced. Who was talking? What did they mean? He felt like he was losing his grip on reality. His vision blurred, the light before him growing brighter and brighter, until it was blinding. Then, suddenly, everything went dark. Silence. The absence of sound was deafening. James could feel his heartbeat in his ears, the only sound in the world. His chest tightened. Where was he? What had happened? He blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness, but then his eyes focused on something ahead of him. A figure. A woman. She stood motionless just ahead of him, her back to him. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall, and her pale skin almost seemed to glow in the darkness. Her clothes were tattered, as though she had been wandering for ages, but there was something about her presence that made James freeze. Who was she? Who are you? James whispered, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned slowly, her head tilting toward him, her eyes meeting his. Her gaze was empty, hollow. Her eyes were black, pitch black like the void. They seemed to swallow him whole, pulling him into them, making him feel small, insignificant. And then she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, unnaturally wide, revealing a set of teeth that were far too sharp for a human. Her lips stretched beyond what should have been possible, her mouth too large for her face. James stumbled back in horror, but the moment he moved, the figure took a step toward him. Her smile never wavered. Why are you running? She asked, her voice cold and distant, like the wind in a graveyard. You can't escape. James felt the blood drain from his face. What do you want from me? The woman's smile widened. I don't want anything from you, James. I want to show you what's already inside you. He took another step back, but the darkness around him seemed to move as if it were closing in. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't escape. His legs gave way and he collapsed to the ground. And then the whispers returned. But this time they weren't just voices in the wind. They were inside his head, echoing in his mind, suffocating him. James, you've always known. The woman knelt down beside him, her face inches from his. Her cold breath brushed against his ear, and in that instant James realized she wasn't just a figure. She was a part of him. She was a part of this place. This nightmare. "This is where you belong," she whispered, her voice sweet and venomous. The world around him seemed to twist, to bend. He could feel his mind unraveling, piece by piece. The shadows, the whispers, the woman, they were all parts of the same thing. The thing that had been chasing him. The thing that had been inside him all along. He wasn't meant to escape. James was no longer sure if he was dreaming or if the nightmare had somehow become his reality. The woman, her grotesque smile still stretching unnaturally across her face, leaned closer. Her eyes, those black hollow pits, pierced through him, and for a split second he felt an overwhelming sensation of despair, like he was being swallowed by the very air around him. "Do you remember now?" she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves in the wind. James felt his heart race in his chest, pounding against his ribcage as if trying to escape. His mind scrambled, desperate to understand what she meant. He couldn't remember anything. Everything before this place, this darkness, was a blur. He felt a deep unease, like something vital was just out of his reach, waiting to be revealed. "No," he choked out, his voice barely a breath. "What do you want from me?" Her smile only widened. "I don't want anything from you, James. You're the one who called me here. You've always known the truth, but you refuse to accept it." James shook his head, the fear mounting like a vice tightening around his chest. He struggled to stand, but his legs were trembling, his body refusing to obey. "I don't understand. What truth? Who are you?" She leaned in closer, and the scent of decay filled his nostrils, making him gag. "You were never meant to escape, James. This place is yours. It's always been yours." The ground beneath him seemed to ripple, as if the very earth had come alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. His surroundings twisted, the dark void warping, folding in on itself, and suddenly he was no longer in the space with the woman. He was back in the house. The room looked different now. The air was thick with the stench of mold and rot, the walls cracked and covered in creeping vines. But it wasn't the house that made James' skin crawl, it was the presence that lingered in the room. It felt suffocating, like something was watching him, waiting. He could feel its gaze like cold fingers crawling up his spine. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, an invasive whisper that wouldn't leave him alone. "You think you can escape, but you've always been part of this. It's in your blood." James turned, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her eyes now glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Her lips parted, revealing those same jagged teeth, her smile stretched impossibly wide, but now something had changed. Something about her presence had shifted. She wasn't just a figure anymore. She was an embodiment of everything he had been running from. Everything he had been hiding from. He took a step back, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. No, this can't be real. But deep down he knew it was. Everything in his body, every instinct, screamed that he had crossed a line he could never return from. "You can't fight it, James. You never could. You were born for this moment. This is your fate." The room seemed to spin around him as reality itself seemed to fracture. He couldn't tell if the walls were closing in or if he was being pulled into something deeper, darker. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, moving with a life of their own. They reached for him, curling around his feet, dragging him down. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell, unable to escape the suffocating pull of the darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat constricted, and the world around him began to blur into a swirling mass of black and gray. The woman was gone, replaced by something far worse. It was the shape, the shadow. The one he had seen in the corner of his vision all this time. The one that had been waiting, watching. The darkness, alive with malice, consumed him whole. But then, there was a sound. A soft, familiar sound. The sound of children's laughter. It echoed through the walls, a taunting, mocking sound. James' mind, already fragile and breaking, couldn't process it. He tried to move, tried to stand, but the darkness had him pinned, unable to escape. The laughter grew louder. It wasn't just the children. There were others now. More whispers, more voices, more people. They were everywhere, surrounding him. The walls were closing in. He could feel their cold breath on his skin. And then, a face. A young boy, his features obscured by shadows, stood before him. His eyes were wide and empty, black holes where his pupils should have been. He grinned at James, a grin that was too wide, too perfect, as if his face had been stretched beyond its natural limits. "James," the boy's voice was eerie, unsettling, and yet familiar. "You're here with us now." Another figure appeared beside him, this one a woman, her features just as twisted as the boy's. Her smile mirrored the one the woman had shown earlier. The room began to shift again, the walls becoming translucent, revealing images from James' past, flashes of moments he had long forgotten. But they weren't just memories. They were distorted, twisted versions of the truth. The figures in the room began to grow, multiplying until they were no longer human. The shadows consumed them, their bodies distorting into something monstrous. The air became thick with an unbearable pressure, as if the entire house was about to collapse in on itself. James could feel his heart pounding in his ears, the sound of it filling the room. He wanted to scream, but the darkness had stolen his voice, and his breath had turned to dust. "You wanted to know the truth?" The woman's voice echoed through the blackness. "Here it is." And then everything stopped. The air was still. The shadows were gone. James' body went limp, his consciousness faded. He felt the weight of the moment, the cold embrace of the inevitable. He knew the truth now, and it was worse than he could have ever imagined. This place wasn't just a nightmare. It was home. The house, the shadows, the whispers. It was all a part of him. And now there was no escape. You thought exploring a dark, forgotten cave would be just another adventure. A thrill, a challenge. But once you step inside, the air grows thick with an unnatural chill, and the silence weighs heavy, too heavy. Each footstep echoes louder than the last, but it's the whispers you start to hear that make your blood run cold. At first, you think it's just the wind, the natural sounds of the cave playing tricks on your mind. But then they start calling your name. Softly at first, then louder, more urgently. Something is down there with you, something ancient and hungry. It's not just the darkness that's trapping you, it's the cave itself, and it knows your every move. James adjusted the strap of his headlamp, its weak beam flickering slightly as the darkness of the cave pressed in on him. He had always been drawn to the unknown, the sense of adventure and the thrill of exploring places no one else dared to. The cave he and his friends had chosen to explore was not just any cave. It had a reputation, one whispered about in the towns nearby. Old-timers spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices trembling with something more than just fear, something darker. Locals who ventured in never returned, or if they did, they were never the same. But that was the challenge, wasn't it? "Come on, guys. It's just a cave," James said, trying to sound confident. He wasn't sure why he was trying to convince them. Maybe he was trying to convince himself too. Daniel and Leo, his two closest friends, weren't convinced. They stood at the cave entrance, staring into the abyss of darkness ahead. The cave seemed to breathe, its entrance opening like the gaping mouth of some ancient beast. "I don't like this," Daniel muttered. He had always been the more cautious one of the group, the voice of reason. "James, there are better places we can explore. We don't have to do this." But James wasn't one to back down. He had heard the stories. He had done his research. There was nothing about this cave that wasn't just another test of endurance, another adventure to tick off the list. His fingers curled around the flashlight and he took a deep breath, determined. "I've read everything about this cave. No one's ever actually proven anything supernatural. It's all superstition." With that, he stepped forward, pushing through the darkness. Leo followed reluctantly, and after a moment, Daniel sighed and trailed behind them. They ventured deeper, the noise of their footsteps echoing off the jagged walls. The cave was damp, and the air grew colder with each step. "I swear, this place smells like it hasn't been touched in centuries," Leo said, his voice trembling a little. He adjusted his own headlamp, the light flickering weakly. James grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "I told you guys it's just an old cave. We're just a few hundred feet below the surface." But the deeper they went, the quieter it became. There was no sound at all, no echoes, no wind. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to suck in every noise. It was as if the cave was alive, holding its breath, waiting for them to make a sound so it could swallow it whole. Then the whisper started. At first it was so faint that James thought it was just the wind. A faint rustling in the air, a soft breath against his ear. But as they moved deeper, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was impossible to ignore now. "Did you hear that?" James asked, stopping in his tracks. His heart began to pound in his chest, but he shook it off. It was just his imagination. Leo's voice was low, hesitant. "What's going on?" "I heard something." Daniel stopped, his face pale under the dim light of his headlamp. "You're right. There's definitely something. Something in the air. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel right." James turned around, trying to remain calm. "It's just an old cave. Maybe it's some natural sound. We're not alone here. There's bound to be creatures. Let's keep moving." The whisper came again, clearer this time. "James?" He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't his friends. It wasn't an animal. The voice, it was speaking his name. James, come closer. James' heart hammered in his chest. He felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. He turned to his friends. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But they didn't answer. Daniel's eyes were wide with fear, his lips trembling. Leo's face was pale, his body rigid with tension. I told you this was a bad idea, Daniel muttered, taking a step backward, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. James ignored him. He couldn't. Something inside him, the same curiosity, the same daring spirit that had driven him to enter the cave in the first place, urged him forward. There was something in that voice. It had called to him and he couldn't turn back. Come on guys, he said, though his own voice sounded strained, uncertain now. It's nothing. Just some weird cave acoustics. But the voice called again, louder this time. It sounded closer. James, come closer, we've been waiting for you. Without thinking, James stepped forward, his footfall echoing through the cave. Leo grabbed his arm. No. James, we need to leave. This isn't funny anymore. But James shrugged him off, his eyes locked on the path ahead. The darkness before him felt alive, and it was as though the cave was waiting for him, calling him into its depths. As they continued on, the walls seemed to close in around them. The passageway narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. The temperature dropped significantly, their breath visible in the air. The whispers were constant now, surrounding them, echoing in their ears. But it wasn't just the whispering voices anymore. There were other sounds, scratching, tapping, like something was following them, always just out of sight. Suddenly, the path opened up, revealing a massive chamber. The cave widened to an enormous hall, its walls stretching far above them, swallowed in complete darkness. A single stone pedestal stood in the center of the room, bathed in an unnatural light that didn't seem to come from anywhere. The whispers had stopped. The silence now was deafening. James, it's here? The voice, clearer now, seemed to come from all directions. James took a step forward, drawn to the pedestal. He felt a strange compulsion, an undeniable pull toward it. His body moved on its own accord, as if the cave had taken control. Leo and Daniel stood frozen in place, unwilling to move. James, don't. Daniel's voice trembled, barely audible. James ignored him. His hand reached out for the pedestal. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold stone, the ground beneath them shook violently. The cave groaned and rumbled, the walls cracking as though the cave itself were waking up from a long slumber. James stumbled backward, his heart racing. He tried to look around, but the shadows seemed to close in, thick and suffocating. The whispers returned, louder than ever. And then, the screams. James, you shouldn't have come. They weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, agonized, desperate, pleading. The air grew thick with dread, the temperature plummeting even further. James looked up in horror as a shadow seemed to form in the center of the room. It was a figure, tall and dark, its features twisted and formless. Get out, Daniel shouted, pulling at James' arm, but it was no use. The shadow was growing, filling the space, and the air was thick with something ancient, something malevolent. The shadow seemed to reach out, its form stretching toward them, its voice cold and hollow. You shouldn't have come. James wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen, caught in the thrall of something far more powerful than anything he had ever experienced. The cave, the darkness, the whispering, it was all a part of it. They were its prey now. And in the end, there was no escape. It was a small town tucked away in the heart of nowhere. A place where everyone knew everyone else and where secrets had a way of getting buried, just like the past. The town's name was Ashford, a town that hadn't seen much excitement in years. But that was all about to change. Elliot Tanner was new to town. He had moved from the city, seeking a quieter life, away from the noise and chaos of the urban jungle. But the moment he stepped into Ashford, he felt something wasn't right. It wasn't the people. No, they were welcoming and friendly enough. It was the land itself, the earth beneath his feet, as though something deep below was stirring, waiting for him to uncover its presence. It all started on his first night. He had just settled into his new home, a small house at the edge of town, tucked near the woods. The windows creaked with the wind, and the old wooden floors groaned with every step he took. The house had been empty for years, its former occupants long gone, and the stories of what had happened to them were just that, stories. He didn't believe in rumors. But something was off. As Elliot sat in his living room, flicking through channels on the TV, he felt a strange sensation, a tingling on the back of his neck. He turned his head toward the window, half expecting to see someone watching him from the trees, but the night was still, only the distant sound of wind rustling through the leaves. Then it happened. A low, rumbling sound emanated from the floor beneath him, like the earth itself was groaning. Elliot froze. His breath hitched as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from beneath the house. Heart pounding, he rose from the couch and moved cautiously to the basement door. The sound continued, something scraping, dragging like claws against the stone. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn away, but curiosity got the better of him. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't let fear control him. Taking a deep breath, he opened the basement door. The moment he stepped into the basement, the air felt different, heavier, colder, and the sound intensified. Elliot crept down the stairs, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. As he reached the bottom, he felt it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. But there was no one there. The room was empty, save for old boxes and furniture covered in dust. The sound had stopped. A silence settled over him like a thick blanket, suffocating and unnatural. But Elliot's eyes were drawn to something strange. In the far corner of the room, beneath a pile of old blankets and furniture, something glinted faintly in the dim light. He moved toward it, his heart racing. As his hand brushed aside the dust and debris, he uncovered a metal hatch, old and rusted, hidden in the corner of the basement floor. His fingers trembled as he touched the hatch. The sound was coming from down there. He could feel it. He hesitated, but the same gnawing curiosity urged him forward. He grabbed the rusted handle and yanked. The hatch creaked open with an agonizing screech. What lay below was not just a basement. What lay below was a hole, a vast cavern stretching deep into the earth. The smell of dampness and decay hit him all at once, and the air was thick with something foul, something ancient. The low rumbling sound had returned, louder now, almost deafening. Elliot's pulse quickened as he peered into the abyss, the beam of his flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. He stepped forward, his foot descending into the hole. The sound grew stronger, like something was moving down there, something alive. He hesitated, but then, with one final glance upward, he descended into the cavern. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and the walls seemed to close in around him. His heart raced as the rumbling grew louder, faster. It was as if something was chasing him, or perhaps something was waiting for him. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming, suffocating. And then he saw it. In the distance, faint and twisted, was a figure. The shadows distorted, contorted, as if the darkness itself had taken on a shape. Elliot froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, but its eyes glowed in the dark, pale and wide, like orbs of moonlight. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure drew closer, impossibly fast, and as it did, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The earth moaned and groaned, like the creature was dragging itself from beneath the earth. The air became thick with the stench of rot and decay, suffocating him with each breath. The monster was rising. The creature finally emerged from the shadows, its form long and twisted, like a malformed shadow of a person. Its limbs were disproportionate, gnarled and long, its body covered in what looked like old, decaying skin. The eyes, those cold, lifeless orbs, glowed with an eerie light. It tilted its head as though studying him, and then let out a low growl that rattled the bones in his chest. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth was dry, his limbs frozen in terror. The monster opened its mouth, far too wide for something so small, and a guttural hiss escaped. It took one slow step toward him, its claws scraping the floor, sending vibrations through the air. Without thinking, Elliot turned and ran. The ground shifted beneath him, and he stumbled, the floor shaking with every step. The creature's breath was hot on his neck, and he could feel its presence closing in, an unbearable weight on his back. The walls of the cavern seemed to close around him, squeezing the life out of him. But as he reached the exit, the ground beneath him cracked open, and he fell. Down, deeper into the darkness. The monster's shadow loomed above him, stretching impossibly long, until it swallowed him whole. When they found his body weeks later, there were no signs of struggle. No marks, no wounds. Just an empty, lifeless corpse. The only clue to what happened was the hole in the basement, the same hole that led to the monster beneath the town. The hole that had been waiting for someone to open it, for someone to awaken the creature that slumbered there. And as for Ashford, the town never spoke of the monster again. But every night, when the wind howled through the trees, the people would whisper that something was still there, beneath the earth, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon the hatch. Los Angeles, home to fame, fortune, and an ever-present shadow of mystery. But there's one location that stands out among the rest, the Cecil Hotel. Nestled on the outskirts of downtown, This hotel has a chilling reputation that has captured the attention of those curious about the macabre and unexplained. Our story begins in the early 20th century, when the Cecil first opened its doors in 1924. At the time, it was a luxurious establishment, the epitome of sophistication, attracting both tourists and business people. However, despite its initial promise, the hotel's fate was marked by an ominous history that would unfold over decades. The first signs of trouble. Over the years, reports of strange occurrences and unsettling events began to surface. The hotel became known as a place where the dark and the twisted seemed to thrive. Deaths, suicides, and inexplicable disappearances became more common as time passed. Guests reported eerie, cold drafts in their rooms, voices echoing through the hallways when no one was there, and the feeling of being watched, even in the most private moments. But it wasn't until the 1950s that the Cecil's true darkness began to fully manifest. The story of one guest would forever change the reputation of this hotel, and the event that would unfold remains one of the most chilling and mysterious in modern history. The case of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. In 1947, a crime occurred that would forever haunt the streets of Los Angeles. The murder of Elizabeth Short, better known as the Black Dahlia. Short was found brutally murdered, her body cut in half and drained of blood. Though no one could ever prove it, many believed the Cecil Hotel was connected to this infamous crime. Some of her last known locations pointed to the hotel, but what truly shocked the public was that one of the last people to see her alive was a man staying at the Cecil at the time. As the case unfolded, more chilling connections emerged between the hotel and various unsolved murders, fueling the belief that the Cecil was a hotspot for tragedy. The hotel's decline into madness. By the 1980s and 90s, the Cecil's reputation had fully spiraled into the realm of horror. What was once a symbol of luxury had become a haven for the lost and troubled. Homeless people, criminals, and individuals with nowhere else to turn began to fill the hotel's rooms. During this time, a series of even more disturbing events began to occur, and the hotel's name became synonymous with death. In 1985, a serial killer named Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, checked into the Cecil. Over the course of several months, Ramirez murdered at least 13 people in Los Angeles, and many believe he stayed at the hotel during his killing spree. His presence was felt in the eerie atmosphere of the Cecil, as guests reported seeing him lurking around the hallways, his disheveled appearance and unsettling demeanor fitting perfectly within the hotel's grim ambience. Some even claim to have seen him enter the hotel with blood on his clothes after a killing spree. The mysterious death of Elisa Lam. Fast forward to 2013, and the Cecil Hotel was now known as the Hotel Death. By this time, the building had fallen into disrepair, and its rooms were no longer occupied by the wealthy or famous. Most people avoided the area, but some who were unaware of the hotel's dark past still booked rooms, unaware of the horrors that lay in wait. The most famous and chilling event to occur at the Cecil happened in February 2013, when 21-year-old Elisa Lam, a Canadian student, checked into the hotel. She had been traveling alone, exploring Los Angeles while posting updates on her blog. Lam seemed to be an ordinary tourist, until the day she disappeared. Lam's body was discovered days later in the hotel's water tank on the roof. But the mystery surrounding her death was unlike anything the public had ever seen before. Surveillance footage from the hotel's elevator captured Lam acting strangely moments before her disappearance. She appeared to press buttons, speak to an unseen figure, and even hide in the corner of the elevator, her behavior erratic and disturbing. The footage ends with her disappearing from view. At the time of her death, there were no signs of forced entry or foul play in her room, and her cause of death was ruled as accidental drowning. However, the strange behavior on the footage, along with the fact that she had been missing for several days before her body was found, only deepened the mystery surrounding the Cecil Hotel. Some believe that Lam's death was caused by something supernatural, while others suspect foul play by other guests. But no one could ever definitively explain what had happened. Was she simply a victim of her circumstances, or was something far darker at play? The legacy of the Cecil. Since Lam's death, the hotel has been the subject of countless investigations, documentaries, and books, all attempting to uncover the truth behind the horrific events that have plagued the Cecil Hotel for decades. It was eventually closed and rebranded as Stay on Main in an attempt to distance itself from the chilling legacy it had built. However, the reputation of the hotel remains, and its dark past continues to haunt the minds of those who dare to learn about it. The Cecil Hotel remains a symbol of the sinister, a place where death and madness have been intertwined for nearly a century. The stories of the Black Dahlia, Richard Ramirez, Elisa Lam, and countless other tragedies that have unfolded within its walls remain etched in history. There's an old saying about the hotel: the building itself is cursed. Whether that's true or not is up for debate, but the stories speak for themselves. The haunted halls of the Cecil Hotel will always be remembered as a place where darkness thrived, where lives were lost, and where the shadows of the past continued to linger. In the dense, secluded forests of the Pacific Northwest, there lies a haunting story that many locals refuse to talk about. The story is one of chilling disappearances, unexplainable noises, and the eerie sense that something watching lingers within the thick woods. It all began in the fall of 2008, in the vast and treacherous Olympic National Park in Washington state. Known for its towering trees, moss-covered rocks, and an aura of mystery that has captivated adventurers for years, this forest has been the site of many unexplained events, but none more unsettling than the story of one hiker who went in and never came back out. The unassuming hiker. Joshua Davis was an avid hiker, a man who thrived on the tranquility of nature and the rush of reaching the peaks of wild, untamed terrain. He had been to many forests, scaling mountains and walking deep into secluded trails, always with a map in hand and a camera to document his adventures. But what began as a typical hike turned into something no one could have predicted. On an early October morning, Joshua set out alone for a hike in the Olympic National Park, a place he'd been to several times before. This time, he intended to venture down a trail called the Enchanted Valley, a place that some locals referred to as the Valley of the Lost, due to its reputation for swallowing hikers whole. Joshua had no fear. He was used to trekking through thick woods, relying on his instincts and experience. But what he didn't know was that the forest had been hiding its secrets for centuries. Deep within its shadows, something stirred. It wasn't just wildlife or the usual predators. There was something far more sinister. Something watching from the darkened corners of the trees, waiting for the right moment. Strange sounds. The first sign that something was wrong came late in the afternoon. Joshua had been hiking for hours, enjoying the peaceful solitude that only nature could provide. However, as the sun began to set, he heard it, a soft rustling coming from the trees behind him. At first, he dismissed it as an animal, perhaps a squirrel or a deer, nothing to worry about. But the sound continued. A low, shuffling noise that was almost deliberate. Not the natural rustling of leaves or animal movements. This was different. It was too controlled. Joshua's instincts kicked in. He froze, turning his head slowly to look behind him, but saw nothing. No creature, no movement, just the darkening woods. He took a deep breath and continued on, telling himself it was nothing. But the sounds followed him. They grew louder as the night descended. The rustling became sharper, more urgent. He was no longer alone in the woods. The disappearance. By nightfall, Joshua had reached a clearing. He made camp near a small stream, setting up his tent and building a fire to keep the cold and the dark at bay. The crackling of the fire was the only sound until, again, that rustling noise returned, closer now. His heart began to race. He could feel his stomach knot with unease, but he tried to calm himself. After all, he was just a few miles from the trailhead, a place where hikers typically ended their journeys. He decided to check his surroundings. With a flashlight in hand, he ventured out into the dark woods, scanning the trees, half expecting to see some wild animal lurking in the shadows. But when he shined his light toward the trees, he saw something else. A figure, a silhouette barely distinguishable against the dark night, was standing among the trees. At first, Joshua thought it was another hiker. He called out, "Hello," but the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there motionless. He stepped closer, the rustling sound now increasing in volume. The figure remained still, its form unnaturally stiff. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, as though it had melted into the night. Joshua's heart pounded in his chest. He backed away, his mind racing. What had he just seen? It couldn't have been a person. No one would be out here at this hour, especially not in the middle of the night. The search. The next morning, Joshua was gone. His camp was found, the fire long extinguished, but there was no sign of him anywhere. His backpack, tent, and personal belongings remained untouched, but there was no trace of Joshua. A search was immediately launched, with teams combing the area for days. But despite their efforts, Joshua had simply vanished. No footprints, no blood, no sign of a struggle. He had seemingly disappeared into thin air. As days turned into weeks, the search efforts were scaled back. The wilderness had claimed another lost soul, and the eerie sense of unease that had settled over the forest only grew stronger. Locals whispered about the darkness of the Olympic National Park, the unseen forces that lingered within its depths, waiting for the right moment to claim those who wandered too far. The unsolved mystery. To this day, Joshua Davis's disappearance remains a mystery. Despite numerous theories, ranging from wild animal attacks to foul play, nothing can explain what happened to him that night. His family was left with nothing but unanswered questions and an unspeakable horror that no one could comprehend. But the most chilling aspect of this story is not the fact that Joshua disappeared. It's the unsettling feeling that something more sinister was at play. The rustling sounds, the figure in the woods, the overwhelming sense that the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. Since Joshua's disappearance, many others have gone missing in the same area, and no one has been able to explain why. Some believe the forest is cursed, a place where the lost are swallowed by the very earth itself, never to be seen again. Others think that something far darker is at work, an ancient force that lurks beneath the trees, hunting those who dare to venture too deep. Joshua Davis was never found, and his story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can take root in the most unexpected places. The forest has a way of keeping its secrets, and sometimes those secrets are not meant to be uncovered.